A homeless Navy SEAL spent his last $50 on a sea fort. Then his K-9 found a WWII secret worth $4.2 million on Washington's storm-beaten coast. Caleb Morgan had $71, an aging pickup, and Bear, the retired military K-9 who had kept him alive through war and the years after it. Everyone laughed when Caleb bought an abandoned WWII fort for $50. But that first night, Bear froze before a welded steel door that county blueprints said had nothing behind it but solid rock. Before we go inside, comment 1 if you'd trust Bear and open that door, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. Rain tapped softly against the roof of Caleb Morgan's old Ford pickup before dawn, steady enough to sound almost peaceful. Caleb knew better. Peace did not usually wake him at 4 in the morning with one hand wrapped around an imaginary rifle. For several seconds, he stared through the windshield without understanding where he was. The glass had fogged from the cold. Beyond it, the pasture behind Weller Ranch rolled away beneath a November sky the color of wet steel. Black cattle stood near a fence line. Farther west, dark pine-covered ridges disappeared into low clouds drifting in from the Pacific. Bear lifted his head from the passenger side floor. The 9-year-old German shepherd said nothing. He rarely needed to. Caleb slowly loosened his right hand. No rifle, just the edge of an old sleeping bag. "Morning," he whispered. Bear's graying muzzle rested on Caleb's knee. Caleb was 45, though lately mirrors made him look older. His hair was cut short because it required no thought. His beard had gone several days past respectable. A scar ran pale along one side of his jaw, and another disappeared beneath the collar of his faded thermal shirt. His left knee carried the deeper damage, the kind nobody noticed until stairs, rain, or cold weather reminded him. Bear pushed his nose harder against that knee. "I'm awake." The dog remained there. Caleb understood. He put one hand on Bear's neck and counted 5 slow breaths. In, hold, out. The technique had a medical name. Caleb had forgotten it. Bear had never needed one. A knock sounded against the driver's window. Caleb's body tightened before his mind caught up. Bear was on his feet instantly. "Easy." Caleb wiped condensation from the glass. Walter Henson, owner of Weller Ranch, stood outside in a waxed canvas jacket and battered hat. He was almost 70 and moved with the careful stiffness of a man who had spent 50 winters around livestock. Caleb rolled the window down 2 inches. Cold rain blew inside. "Walt, morning, Caleb." Neither man said anything for a moment. That was enough. Caleb looked toward the ranch house in the distance. "When?" Walter lowered his eyes. "County insurance inspection yesterday." Caleb nodded once. Walter continued. "They saw the truck back here. Asked how long you'd been staying. 3 weeks, I told them, temporary. You didn't lie." "No." Another silence. Walter rubbed rain from his chin. "They won't cover me if somebody's living on the property who isn't an employee or tenant." I argued. Didn't matter. Caleb looked at Bear. Walter looked too. "I hate doing this." "Don't. Caleb. You gave us 3 weeks. I could maybe get you another night." Caleb reached for the ignition. "No, you've done enough." Walter's expression tightened. "You need money?" "No." That answer came too fast. They both knew it. Walter finally stepped back. "There's coffee at the house." Caleb almost refused that too. Bear stared at him. Caleb sighed. "Coffee." Walter nodded and walked toward the ranch house. Caleb waited until he was gone before reaching into the center console. A folded 20, another 20, a 10, 3 fives, 6 $1 bills, $71. That was everything. He counted it twice anyway. Bear watched. Financial planning, Caleb said. Bear blinked. Don't judge me. An hour later, Caleb drove east through Greyhaven beneath low clouds and hard rain. The town sat where forest, farmland, and ocean had been forced into an uneasy agreement. Fishing boats crowded the harbor. Old warehouses leaned against the waterfront. A diner with a red neon sign glowed beside a gas station. Beyond the roofs, the Olympic Mountains rose white and distant under the storm, their upper slopes already buried in snow. Caleb parked outside the county administration building because a handwritten sign promised free coffee during public hearings. That was the only reason he went inside. At least, that was what he told himself. Bear stayed in the truck with the windows cracked while Caleb entered a room filled with folding chairs, fluorescent light, damp coats, and people who smelled faintly of rain and coffee. A county clerk was reading from a list, Parcel 17, Fort Alder Coastal Defense Property. A few people chuckled. Caleb poured coffee into a paper cup. The clerk continued. World War II-era military installation on approximately 19 coastal acres. Structures include upper barracks, observation station, 2 gun batteries, underground service spaces, access road, and cliffside defensive works, someone behind Caleb muttered. And enough mold to qualify as agriculture, more laughter. The clerk kept reading. No active utilities. Significant deferred maintenance. Structural instability in restricted sections. Coastal erosion concerns. Environmental review required before major renovation. A man near the front raised his hand. What's the opening bid? It's not an auction. The county is offering a symbolic deed transfer, meaning $50. The room laughed louder. The clerk did not. The purchaser assumes taxes, stabilization costs, liability, historic preservation obligations, access restrictions, and all future maintenance. A fisherman in a wool cap called out, $50 for a concrete coffin. Ocean view, another man answered. Caleb stopped drinking. On the wall behind the clerk hung an aerial photograph. Fort Alder sat on a massive black headland west of town. Forest covered the ridge behind it. The Pacific hammered the cliffs below. The upper barracks looked half swallowed by grass, but the walls were thick, thicker than the motel rooms Caleb could no longer afford. The clerk looked around. No applicant has submitted interest. If no qualified party accepts transfer today, the county will continue pursuing demolition funding. Caleb heard himself speak. I'll take it. The room quieted, then people turned. Several recognized him, the man who slept in the Ford, the former SEAL who sometimes ate at the harbor diner and sometimes disappeared for weeks, the man with the old military dog. The fisherman in the wool cap stared at him. You serious? Caleb walked toward the table. The clerk adjusted her glasses. Sir, you understand this is not habitable property. That's what I heard. Do you understand the liability? No electricity? Correct. No water? Correct. Roof sections are compromised. Caleb removed the bills from his pocket. 2 20s, 110. He placed them on the table. Someone laughed again. Man just spent his last $50 on a bunker. Kate looked over his shoulder. The laughter faded. At least nobody can evict me from where I sleep. Nobody answered that. The paperwork took 40 minutes. By noon, Caleb Morgan owned Fort Alder. He also had $21 left. Bear greeted this new financial reality by eating half of a gas station sandwich. The road to the fort climbed west from Greyhaven Harbor, past abandoned military fencing, then narrowed beneath enormous Sitka spruce trees, bent permanently by coastal wind. The rain worsened. Fort Alder appeared through the trees without warning. Gray concrete, black stone, rusting steel. The old observation tower stood above the cliff like a blind man facing the ocean. Caleb stopped the truck at the broken gate. Bear sat upright beside him. Home. Bear stared ahead. Try to contain yourself. Inside, Fort Alder smelled of wet stone, salt, rust, and decades of neglect. Caleb chose an upper watchroom because its roof mostly held. He dragged in his sleeping bag, 2 blankets, a lantern, Bear's food, and an old camp stove. Wind moaned through empty corridors. Waves struck the cliff somewhere below with deep, irregular booms. By nightfall, the storm had become violent. Caleb lay on the floor with Bear near his boots. Then metal slammed somewhere in the fort. Caleb was no longer in Washington. Heat, dust, a concrete compound, someone shouting through radio static, a flash beyond a doorway. Ryan. Caleb came upright so fast his shoulders struck the wall, his chest locked, the room narrowed. Another metallic crash rolled through the fort. His hands searched for equipment that had not been there for 8 years. Move. No one moved. Ryan, move. Bear crossed the room. The dog pressed his entire body against Caleb's legs. Caleb did not see him at first, then Bear pushed harder. Warm weight. Fur. Gray muzzle, Washington, Fort Alder, November. Caleb put both hands against Bear's shoulders. Here. Bear held still. Caleb breathed. Here, again, I'm here. His pulse gradually slowed. The storm became a storm again. The walls became walls. Bear waited until Caleb's breathing was almost normal. Then the dog suddenly turned toward the open doorway. Bear? He walked out. Caleb grabbed the lantern and followed. Bear moved down the corridor, past an empty ammunition room and a collapsed stairwell, deeper into the fort. Bear. No response. That was unusual. They descended 6 concrete steps into the eastern battery. The air grew colder. At the far end stood a massive blast door welded shut across its frame. County markings were still visible through rust. Sealed, 1968. Bear stopped in front of it. His ears rose. Caleb came beside him. Nothing there. He remembered the blueprint from the transfer packet. Eastern service corridor terminated against natural cliff. Solid rock beyond. Bear sat. A minute passed, then another. The dog tilted his head slightly, listening. Caleb raised the lantern. Rainwater ran along one wall. Rust covered the steel door. Nothing moved. Come on. Bear remained seated. Bear. No response. Caleb stepped closer. The dog gave a tiny sound. Not a growl, not fear. A low, uncertain whine Caleb had heard only a handful of times during their working years. Usually when Bear knew something was present, but could not yet explain it. Caleb looked at the steel, then at the concrete surrounding it. The Pacific struck the cliff below. The fort trembled. Bear's eyes never left the door. Caleb lowered himself beside him, ignoring the ache in his knee. According to every county drawing, there was nothing behind that steel except 20 feet of solid coastal rock. Bear leaned forward. His nose hovered an inch above the bottom seam. Then his ears sharpened again, listening. Caleb stared at the welded door. For the first time since spending his last $50, he forgot that he was homeless. All right, he whispered. Bear did not look at him. Caleb placed one hand against the cold steel. What do you hear? Bear did not move. The storm rolled over Fort Alder in long, heavy waves of sound. Wind pushed through cracks in the old battery. moaning through empty conduits and broken vents. Somewhere below, the Pacific struck the base of the cliff with enough force to send a faint vibration through Caleb's palm. But Bear was not listening to the ocean. Caleb knew the difference. He had watched the dog isolate footsteps beneath gunfire, detect a man behind a concrete wall, and find explosives hidden under garbage while engines screamed nearby. Bear could separate one sound from 100. Now his torn-edged ears were angled toward the bottom of the blast door. Caleb lowered the lantern. A narrow drainage channel ran beneath the steel frame. Rust and mineral deposits had nearly closed it. He held his fingers near the gap. Nothing. Then, warmth. So faint he almost dismissed it. Caleb waited. Another breath of air touched his skin. Not warm like a heater. Warm compared with the freezing corridor. He leaned closer. That's impossible. Bear finally looked at him. County plans showed 20 feet of solid basalt behind the blast door. Solid rock did not breathe. Caleb spent the rest of the night trying not to think about it. That failed. By morning, the storm had moved inland, leaving Greyhaven Point washed in cold silver light. Fog drifted between the spruce trees above the fort. The Pacific was still rough, but sunlight occasionally broke through the clouds and turned the water bright as hammered metal. Caleb had slept perhaps 90 minutes. Bear had slept less. The dog was already waiting beside the eastern battery when Caleb returned, carrying the rolled county blueprints, a flashlight, a screwdriver, and the bent pry bar he kept behind the truck seat. You've become obsessive in retirement. Bear ignored him. Caleb spread the plans across an old ammunition crate. The eastern section was simple. Gun room, service corridor, drainage, then cliff, no storage chamber, no tunnel, no utility void, nothing. Caleb traced the line with one finger. Maybe the drawing's wrong. Bear stared at the door. Strong argument. Caleb crouched beside the drainage channel. Daylight made details easier to see. The concrete around the doorframe was old, but not uniform. Some sections carried the soft, rounded erosion of 80 years of coastal damp. Other patches had sharper edges, repairs. He took out the screwdriver and scraped at mineral buildup. A thread of air touched his knuckles again. Caleb stopped. Then he held the flame of a cheap lighter near the opening. The flame leaned toward him. Airflow. Definitely. He sat back slowly. Someone had sealed something behind the blast door. Or the county did not know its own fort. Neither possibility made him comfortable. A vehicle engine sounded outside. Bear turned instantly. Caleb rolled the plans closed. The vehicle stopped near the courtyard. A man's voice called through the upper corridor. "Mr. Morgan?" Caleb recognized the name before the voice. He walked toward the entrance, with Bear beside him. A dark green SUV stood near the old barracks. It was clean enough to look strange against the rust and wet concrete. The man beside it wore a waxed field coat over a white shirt, dark jeans, and expensive boots that had probably never spent a night beside a sleeping bag. Caleb had seen his photograph around Greyhaven. Grant Holloway, developer, hotel owner, donor to the volunteer fire department, name on the brass plaque outside the public library. Grant smiled when Caleb approached. "I hope I'm not trespassing." Caleb looked around at 19 acres of broken concrete. "Depends. You planning to steal anything?" Grant laughed. "Not today." He opened the rear hatch of the SUV. Inside sat a portable generator, 2 propane cylinders, bottled water, canned food, and a large bag of senior dog food. Caleb's expression changed. Grant noticed. Consider it a housewarming gift. I don't take charity. Good, neither do I. Grant pulled the generator toward the edge. I'm investing in county safety. If the new owner freezes to death during his first week, Fort Alder becomes my tax problem again. Caleb studied him. Grant was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered but soft around the middle, gray beginning at the temples. His manner was easy without being careless. Bear walked closer. Grant held one hand out but did not try to touch him. That's Bear. Caleb stiffened slightly. How do you know his name? Whole town knows his name now. By breakfast, you two were apparently local folklore. Bear sniffed Grant's hand, then stepped away. No growl, no warning, just observation. Grant looked toward the fort. My grandfather used to talk about this place. Caleb caught that. He served here, worked around military contracting after the war. Greyhaven families all claim some connection to Fort Alder if you listen long enough. Grant glanced toward the ocean. My company looked at purchasing this property 3 years ago. Why didn't you county liability, preservation law, erosion? Every lawyer I employ threatened to resign. Smart lawyers. I pay them to be afraid. That almost earned a smile from Caleb. Grant reached inside his coat and removed an envelope, which brings me to the embarrassing part. Caleb did not take it. Grant continued. I'd like to buy the fort. You just said your lawyers hated it. They hate most things worth doing. How much? 30,000. Caleb thought he had misheard. Grant handed him a printed offer. $30,000. Cash purchase. Closing costs covered. No requirement for Caleb to repair anything. Caleb stared at the number. Yesterday he had owned $71. Today a man was offering enough money to put him inside a small apartment for a year, maybe longer. Grant nodded toward Caleb's left leg. There's a clinic in Port Angeles that works with veterans, knee reconstruction, physical therapy. Caleb's gaze hardened. Grant raised one hand. I asked around. That's what developers do before spending money. You ask around about homeless veterans. I ask about property owners. The correction landed differently. Grant looked toward Bear. And senior working dogs aren't cheap. You know that better than I do. Caleb folded the offer. For one dangerous second, he imagined heat. A bed, a refrigerator, a bathroom with a door. Bear sleeping somewhere without rainwater dripping through concrete 20 feet away. $30,000 was not wealth. To Caleb, it looked almost like rescue. He handed the paper back. No, Grant blinked. That was quick. I bought it yesterday for $50. Still mine. Grant studied him. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Fair enough. No pressure, no threat. He put the offer back inside his coat. Keep the supplies, I said. They're already unloaded. Caleb looked behind him. During the conversation, Grant had quietly set the dog food beside the generator. That's manipulative. I develop hotels. Grant closed the SUV hatch. It's practically a licensing requirement. Before leaving, he paused by the driver's door. If you change your mind, call me. Caleb nodded. Grant drove away through the broken gate. Bear watched until the SUV disappeared among the trees. Caleb looked down. What? Bear turned back toward the eastern battery. Of course. By late afternoon, Caleb had the generator running. One working lamp transformed the watchroom from tomb to merely depressing. He heated soup. Bear ate better than Caleb did. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt something dangerously close to possibility. $30,000 still existed somewhere outside the fort. A way out, and for once, someone had spoken to him, as if he were an owner rather than a problem. That feeling lasted until after dark. Caleb woke to scratching, not nightmare scratching, metal. He sat up. Bear was gone again. Bear. The sound continued. Caleb took the flashlight and limped down the corridor. The dog was at the blast door, clawing. Hey! Bear scraped the same spot near the lower right edge. Bear, leave it. He did not. The command should have stopped him. It didn't. Caleb moved closer. Bear clawed again. A brittle plate of corrosion broke free and struck the concrete floor. Caleb froze. Beneath 80 years of brown rust was a narrow strip of exposed steel. But the metal did not look 80 years old. The scrape marks were bright, sharp, parallel, tool marks. Caleb crouched. He ran one finger across them. No heavy oxidation. Someone had disturbed this section recently enough that the steel beneath had not fully aged back into the surrounding rust. He examined the nearby weld. At first glance, it looked original. It wasn't. Several beads crossed older corrosion, new weld over old steel. Caleb's small moment of hope vanished. Bear stepped back. The dog looked toward him. Caleb remembered Grant saying his grandfather used to talk about Fort Alder. He remembered the county plan, solid rock. He remembered the warm air breathing through the drainage channel. And now this. Someone had opened or repaired this door long after Fort Alder was supposedly abandoned. Caleb stood slowly. Outside, darkness covered the Pacific. The fort creaked around them. Bear turned toward the steel again. Caleb raised the flashlight and followed the beam across the welded frame. "All right," he whispered. This time, Bear looked at him. "Tomorrow we find out why somebody wanted this door to look closed." Morning came without rain. That somehow made Fort Alder feel more exposed. A pale November sun climbed over the Olympic foothills, touching the cattle country east of Greyhaven with weak gold, while the Pacific remained dark and restless below the cliffs. Mist hung between the spruce trees. From the upper observation slit, Caleb could see fishing boats moving toward the harbor like small black marks on steel-gray water. He drank instant coffee beside the county blueprints. Bear waited at the doorway. Caleb tapped the eastern battery on the drawing. Solid rock. Bear's tail moved once. "You've made your position clear." Caleb had spent enough years around breaching operations to know that the obvious entrance was often the worst entrance. The blast door was welded shut. Cutting it without knowing what lay behind it could ignite trapped fumes, weaken surrounding concrete, or destroy whatever someone had worked so hard to hide. So Caleb stopped looking at the door. He started looking at everything connected to it. Old military structures were built around redundancy, electrical conduits, drainage, ventilation, emergency access. Men expected machinery to fail, ammunition to burn, doors to jam. Concrete remembered those expectations even when blueprints did not. Caleb traced a narrow maintenance conduit from the eastern battery toward an abandoned radio room. It disappeared behind a wall marked non-serviceable. That's encouraging. Bear followed him through the corridor. Inside the radio room, rusted cable trays crossed the ceiling. Ceramic insulators still clung to the wall. A dead junction box hung open like a metal mouth. Caleb swept his flashlight downward. There, behind a collapsed cabinet, was a rectangular access plate nearly hidden beneath peeling paint. He moved the cabinet. His knee objected immediately. Hun shot upward through his thigh. Caleb stopped, one hand against the wall. Bear came close. "I'm good." Bear stared at him. Caleb breathed through it. "Pain is information." The dog continued staring. "Yes, I know. Bad information." He removed 4 corroded screws from the plate. Behind it was a narrow mechanical shaft, not large enough for a man, large enough for cables and locking rods. Caleb shined the flashlight inside. A steel linkage disappeared toward the blast door. He smiled without humor. "Found your back door." 2 hours later, Caleb understood why the county had missed it. The system had been designed as an emergency release for the original blast assembly. Later repairs had covered most of it, but the internal locking mechanism remained. Someone had disabled it. Someone else had restored part of it. Different decades, different hands. Caleb used penetrating oil, a socket wrench, and the bent pry bar. He worked slowly. Metal groaned inside the wall. Bear stood several feet back. "Stay." This time he obeyed. Caleb pulled. Nothing. He repositioned. Pulled again. A deep metallic knock traveled through the concrete. Bear's ears snapped forward. Caleb froze. Something had moved. He returned to the eastern battery. The blast door still looked sealed, but along the right edge, a gap no wider than a knife blade had appeared. Cold air touched Caleb's face. Then warmer air followed from deeper inside. He smelled dust, dry metal, old paper, and something else, something that made every instinct he had sharpen. He wedged the pry bar into the gap. The modern-looking welds near the bottom were not continuous. They had been placed to appear permanent from a distance. The door had been disguised as sealed. Caleb worked upward until the steel gave a low groan. Bear began whining, "Back!" The German shepherd retreated 3 steps. Caleb pulled again. The door moved 6 inches. Darkness waited behind it. Not rock, a corridor. Caleb stood completely still. The county blueprint had lied by omission or ignorance. He widened the opening just enough to pass through. "Bear, stay!" Bear did not like that. His ears flattened. "I mean it." Caleb entered alone. The temperature changed immediately. The hidden passage was dry. Too dry. His flashlight revealed poured concrete walls untouched by graffiti, rain, or salt bloom. Old electrical cable ran overhead. A faded red stripe followed the wall toward another chamber. Caleb advanced slowly, 20 feet, 30. Then the corridor opened. His flashlight swept across rusted radio racks, a wooden desk, metal cabinets, a wall map of the Washington coast, its paper yellow and curled, an overturned chair. Caleb stopped. On the floor beside the desk was a dark stain, not fresh, not even close, but he had seen enough old blood in enough places to recognize the shape left when someone fell and did not immediately stand again. His breathing changed. Afghanistan flickered at the edge of his vision. Concrete. Radio equipment. Dark stain. A room waiting after violence. Caleb closed his eyes. "Washington," he whispered. He touched the wall. November. One breath. Fort Alder. Behind him came the soft click of claws. Caleb turned sharply. "Bear stood in thy corridor. I told you to stay." Bear walked past him. Apparently, command structure has collapsed. The dog entered the chamber and stopped. Caleb followed his gaze. His flashlight had not reached the far corner. Now it did. A boot appeared first. Old black leather, collapsed inward, then fabric, then bone. Caleb's body became very still. The remains were seated against the wall, partly on one side, as if the man had lowered himself there and never risen again. What remained of a dark naval uniform clung in fragments around the skeleton. Metal buttons reflected the flashlight. On the chest rested dog tags. Bear approached slowly. "Stop." The dog stopped immediately. Voice had changed. This was no longer exploration, no longer property, no longer his fort. A man had died here. Caleb removed his cap. He did not know why. Maybe because some habits survived everything. He crouched several feet from the remains without touching them. The skull rested at an angle. Near one hand lay a corroded service pistol, near the other, a leather document case blackened with age. Caleb looked at the dark stain again, then at the bones. Whatever happened in this room had happened a very long time ago, but not long enough to stop mattering. Bear gave a low sound. Caleb turned. The dog was no longer watching the body. He had moved toward the opposite wall. Bear, the German shepherd, sniffed along a metal ventilation grill near floor level. Caleb stood. "Leave it." Bear sniffed harder, then pawed once. Caleb crossed the chamber. The grill was narrow, perhaps 8 inches high and 2 feet wide. Too small for a person. He crouched beside Bear. A current of air moved through it. That explained the warmth beneath the blast door. Maybe. Caleb aimed the flashlight through the slots. The beam traveled farther than expected. 10 feet, maybe 15. Then, a flash. Caleb moved the light. The reflection appeared again. Steel. There was another metal surface deep inside the ventilation passage. A second barrier. Bear pressed his nose against the grill. Caleb's pulse increased. "There's another room." Bear pawed the metal. "No." Caleb stood immediately. The word echoed through the hidden chamber. He looked at the skeleton. Whatever waited behind that second barrier could wait longer. The dead man could not. Caleb pulled out his phone. There was barely 1 bar of signal. He walked back toward the blast door until 2 appeared. He did not call the Greyhaven Sheriff's Office. He called Washington state authorities. The first dispatcher transferred him twice. The third voice became very attentive when Caleb said the words, "human remains." "My name is Caleb Morgan. I'm the legal owner of Fort Alder at Greyhaven Point. I opened a previously undocumented military chamber approximately 40 minutes ago. The dispatcher asked whether the remains appeared recent. No. Did you touch them? No. Did you move anything? No. Is anyone else present?" Caleb looked toward Bear, "My dog," a pause. "Anyone human?" "No, Mr. Morgan. Leave the chamber and wait for investigators." Caleb looked through the darkness toward the old officer. "I'll wait outside the room, sir. We recommend. I'm not leaving him alone again." Another pause. The dispatcher did not argue. Caleb returned to the command chamber and sat against the opposite wall. Bear settled beside him. Neither went near the remains. Hours passed. Sunlight shifted somewhere outside the fort, but down here time had no weather. Caleb studied the room without moving from his position. The map, the radios, the blood, the dead officer, the ventilation grill, and that second steel reflection beyond it. He thought about how easily a person could disappear if the right paperwork said there was nothing to look for. Eventually, engines sounded outside. Boots entered the fort. A woman's voice called his name. "Caleb Morgan, East Battery." 3 people appeared beyond the blast door. The woman in front wore a dark state investigative jacket and carried herself with quiet authority. She was in her early 40s, brown hair tied back, expression controlled. Laura Bennett, State Investigations. Caleb stood. She noticed the open blast door, then him, then Bear. "You opened this?" "Through the maintenance release. You entered. Only the corridor and command chamber." "Moved anything?" "No." Laura studied his face for a moment. Then she nodded. "Show me." Caleb led them inside. When Laura's flashlight reached the skeleton, everyone stopped. One technician quietly exhaled. Laura approached only as far as necessary. Her beam moved over the uniform, the pistol, the document case, the dog tags. Nobody touches anything until the scene is documented. Caleb nodded. Bear suddenly stood. He went back to the ventilation grill. Laura noticed. What's he doing? The same thing he did at the first door. Bear pawed once. Caleb pointed his flashlight through the grill. The distant steel panel reflected the beam. Laura's expression changed. You've been back there? No. You know what's behind it? No. Bear lowered his nose to the grill and inhaled. Then he looked at Caleb. The room was already impossible. A dead Navy officer hidden behind a blast door. Blood on the floor. A chamber erased from county plans. But Bear was not interested in any of it anymore. He was interested in what waited deeper inside the cliff. Caleb looked at Laura. We found your dead man. Then he turned toward the second steel panel. But I don't think we found what he died protecting. Laura Bennett followed Caleb's flashlight beam through the ventilation grill. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The hidden command chamber had already given them more than Fort Alder was supposed to contain. A dead Navy officer, blood on concrete, documents sealed away from weather for nearly 8 decades. Now there was another wall. Laura straightened. Nobody opens anything else tonight. Bear looked at her. Laura looked back. That includes you. The German shepherd sat beside the grill. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. By sunset, Fort Alder had become a controlled scene. Portable lights glowed inside the eastern battery. Yellow evidence tape crossed the corridor. 2 state vehicles sat beyond the gate, their tires muddy from the cliff road. A forensic team photographed the remains inch by inch before anything was disturbed. Caleb watched from outside the taped boundary. The fort had belonged to him for less than 3 days. Already there were rooms inside he was no longer allowed to enter. He did not mind. Some things mattered more than ownership. The next morning, another vehicle climbed through the spruce forest and stopped beside Caleb's pickup. A thin, older man emerged carrying 2 hard cases and a canvas document bag. He wore a brown wool coat, wire-frame glasses, and a navy blue cap without decoration. His white hair moved wildly in the coastal wind. Laura met him in the courtyard. George Palmer? Unless someone finally stole my identity. She shook his hand. Retired Navy archivist? Retired is what they call you when they want your knowledge but stop paying for it. Caleb was standing nearby with Bear. George noticed the dog first. That's the one. Depends what you've heard, Caleb said, that he found a room the government forgot. George considered Bear. Good dog. Bear allowed the assessment. Inside the command chamber, George's humor disappeared. He studied the radio equipment, wall markings, uniform fragments, and visible identification tags without touching anything. Laura showed him a photograph taken after the forensic team had carefully exposed the tags. George read the name twice. Lieutenant Andrew Pierce. His face changed. You know him? Caleb asked. Know of him. George looked toward the remains. Pierce disappeared in 1945. Here, officially nobody knew. George removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. He was attached to post-war logistics operations along the Washington coast. Then he vanished. Laura asked, AWOL? Worse. George put his glasses back on. Desertion under suspicion of theft. Caleb's eyes narrowed. What did he steal? George looked toward the ventilation grill. That depends on what's behind your second wall. Opening it took another day. Nobody rushed. A small inspection camera went through the ventilation passage first. The images showed a narrow cavity behind the steel panel, dry and apparently stable. Then technicians found a secondary access seam hidden behind an old radio rack. Caleb watched them work. Bear watched harder. When the panel finally moved, it did not swing open dramatically. It resisted, groaned, shifted 2 inches, then 4. Air escaped with a dry whisper. George stood behind Laura. Haplaus stood beside Bear. A technician shined a light inside. Rows of metal cases appeared. Not 7, not 10, 42. They were stacked on steel shelving from floor to ceiling, each protected by a fitted, moisture-resistant cover. George whispered, "Good Lord." The cases carried faded Navy inventory markings. Several still had intact serial plates. Laura stepped closer. Nobody touches them until they're photographed. Caleb looked down at Bear. The dog stared into the compartment with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose argument had finally been proven. You couldn't have found canned beans. Bear's tail moved once. The inventory process lasted hours. One case was eventually opened under controlled conditions. Inside, cushioned by deteriorated packing material, rested a strange mechanical assembly of polished metal rings, precision bearings, wiring housings, and heavy cylindrical components. Caleb had seen navigation equipment before. Nothing like this. George leaned over without touching it. Gyroscopic assembly. Guidance? Laura asked. Experimental navigation stabilization. Probably naval aviation. He pointed toward a small stamped plate. Late war prototype. Caleb studied the device. Why hide 42 of them? George's eyes remained on the serial number. That's an excellent question. By afternoon, photographs and inventory data had been sent to federal military historians and a specialist in obsolete defense technology. The first estimate arrived before dark. Laura read the email twice. George took off his glasses. Caleb sat on an ammunition crate while Bear rested against his boot. Well? Caleb asked. Laura looked up. If the serial numbers and materials are authentic, these assemblies have substantial historical value. How? How substantial? George answered. Potentially millions? Caleb stared at him. George continued. The gyroscopic cores use platinum-iridium components. Some assemblies may be unique surviving prototypes. Historical value, collector value, materials. Laura looked at the figure again. Preliminary estimate is approximately $4.2 million for the collection. Silence. Caleb looked through the open doorway toward 42 gray cases. 4.2 million. 3 days earlier, he had counted $71 inside a truck. He had spent $50 on a fort because he needed somewhere nobody could order him to leave. Now millions of dollars in forgotten military technology sat inside his cliff. Bear yawned. Caleb looked at him. Glad you're impressed. The news escaped before the official statement did. By morning, vehicles lined the road outside Fort Alder. Reporters, curious residents, a local television van. People who had laughed at the county hearing now stood outside the gate holding phones. Caleb heard one man say, "He bought $4 million for $50. Another answered, "Luckiest homeless guy in America." Caleb's jaw tightened. They did not see Andrew Pierce. They saw numbers. Laura ordered the crowd kept outside. George remained inside with the records. Caleb walked back to the command chamber because it was quieter there. The remains had been removed for examination. What remained was the outline of absence. Bear sat near the place where Pierce had been found. Caleb removed his cap again. "Everybody's interested now," he said softly. Bear looked at him. "Funny how money improves hearing." George entered carrying a folder. "We have confirmation on the identification." Caleb stood. "Pierce?" George nodded. "Lieutenant Andrew Pierce, United States Navy, 31 years old when he disappeared." He handed Caleb a photocopy. A black and white service photograph showed a young officer with dark hair, straight posture, and the careful expression common to military portraits. Below it was a notation: missing, presumed deserted, suspected theft of restricted navigation equipment. Caleb looked toward the compartment. The same equipment, apparently. Then why hide himself with it? George did not answer. Laura entered from the corridor. Forensics found no indication Pierce was trying to move the cases out through this chamber. No transport equipment, no packing plan, nothing suggesting he was preparing to sell them. Caleb looked at George. Maybe he wasn't stealing them. "Maybe," George said, "then somebody wrote the wrong story." That sentence stayed with Caleb. Outside, the crowd grew louder. A reporter called his name. Someone shouted that he was rich. Someone else asked whether he planned to sell Fort Alder. Caleb ignored them. Bear suddenly moved toward the open second panel. He sniffed along its inside surface, then stopped. "What now?" Bear touched his nose to the steel. Caleb aimed his flashlight there. At first he saw scratches, corrosion, old condensation stains, then letters, very faint, written in pencil or grease marker before the compartment had been sealed. Caleb wiped away loose dust with the back of his glove. George came closer. Laura raised another light. The words emerged slowly, uneven, pressed hard enough into the steel that parts remained visible after 80 years. "I didn't steal them." Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. Below that was another line. "Find the transfer list." George whispered the words aloud. "Find the transfer list." Outside, someone shouted again about $4.2 million. Inside, nobody moved. Caleb looked towards the empty place where Andrew Pierce had waited in darkness until death. A man officially remembered as a thief had spent his final hours beside the very objects he was accused of stealing. And instead of writing where the fortune was hidden, he had written a denial. Caleb's eyes returned to the old message. He knew what official reports could do. One sentence could turn a mistake into disobedience, a sacrifice into failure, a dead man into the reason everyone else had survived. For one unwanted instant, another name entered his mind. Ryan Keller. Caleb looked away. Not now, but memory had already opened the door. 8 years earlier, a hostage rescue, gunfire in darkness, Ryan leaving his assigned position. An official report Caleb had never challenged. A funeral Caleb had attended from the back row before disappearing from the lives of everyone who had known them both. Bear pressed against his leg. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's neck. George was still staring at Pierce's message. "If that transfer list exists," he said, "it could tell us where these assemblies were actually supposed to go." Laura nodded. "And who had authority over them?" Caleb looked again at the words on the steel. Outside, Greyhaven believed a homeless veteran had found a fortune. Caleb understood something else. Bear had not found treasure. He had found an accusation buried inside a mountain. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive, there was still a piece of paper that could tell them who deserved it. For the next 2 days, George Palmer went looking for that paper. He turned Fort Alder's old watchroom into a temporary archive. Folding tables disappeared beneath photocopies, Navy inventories, wartime personnel lists, maintenance records, and maps of Greyhaven Point drawn before half the roads in town existed. Outside, November hardened. Cold rain swept in from the Pacific. Snow whitened the higher Olympic ridges to the east. The spruce trees above the fort bent under coastal wind, while below the cliff, the ocean rose and fell against black rock like something breathing in its sleep. Caleb stayed close. So did Bear. State investigators had sealed the hidden equipment compartment, and federal officials were already arguing over jurisdiction, preservation, ownership, and transportation. Reporters continued appearing at the gate. Caleb ignored all of them. $4.2 million had become the least interesting thing inside Fort Alder. Andrew Pierce had become the most. George sat beneath a battery lantern one gray afternoon, reading from a copied Navy inventory sheet. Here, Caleb moved closer. George pointed to a column of serial numbers. These are the assemblies scheduled for transfer in September 1945. Caleb compared them with Laura's photographed inventory from the hidden chamber. They don't match. Exactly. George pulled another sheet from beneath a folder. 42 assemblies were supposed to leave Fort Alder for a naval aviation depot in California, and these, the serial numbers found behind the wall, were never listed as departing. Caleb frowned. So Pierce found equipment that wasn't supposed to be here, or equipment somebody wanted the official record to forget. Bear lay beneath the table, muzzle resting on his paws. George turned another page. Pierce was inventory officer for the transfer, meaning he'd see the mismatch. He did. George slid 2 documents across the table. Both were copies of formal complaints. The first reported inconsistencies between physical inventory and shipping manifests. The second was sharper: unauthorized serial substitution, missing transfer authorization, possible diversion of restricted naval property. Caleb read the signature. Andrew Pierce. He reported it twice. What happened? George pointed to a stamp across the bottom. Resolved. Caleb looked at the second complaint. Same stamp, same date range. Resolved by who? George did not answer immediately. Instead, he rotated the paper. A typed name sat beneath the administrative approval. Charles Holloway, Civilian Logistics Coordinator. Caleb stared at it. Holloway, Grant, the generator, the propane, $30,000. My grandfather used to talk about this place. Caleb remembered the words clearly. George watched his face. You know the name? Grant Holloway's grandfather. George leaned back. That would explain why the family knows Fort Alder. It doesn't prove Grant knows any of this. No, George's voice remained careful. Names aren't guilt, Caleb. Neither is blood. Caleb looked at Pierce's complaints. Somebody still buried his complaints. A man's reputation reduced to 3 paragraphs. Caleb's thumb rested against the page. He reported the missing equipment before they accused him of taking it. Laura nodded. That's what the dates suggest, and nobody thought that mattered. George's expression was tired. 45 was chaos. Bases were closing. Men were going home. Records moved. Commands dissolved. Sometimes mistakes disappeared inside the confusion. Caleb looked at him, and sometimes somebody helps them disappear. George did not argue. Rain struck the observation slit. For several seconds, Caleb heard something else. Rotor wash, radio static, a man's breathing, Ryan Keller saying his name. Caleb blinked. Fort Alder returned. He walked away from the table. Bear stood immediately. Caleb reached the corridor before the memory caught him. 8 years earlier, Afghanistan. A hostage rescue that should have lasted 11 minutes, a building with 2 entrances, a civilian trapped upstairs. Caleb wounded before the final assault. Ryan Keller assigned to the western position. Then Ryan moved. The report used that word. Moved. Unauthorized repositioning. It sounded almost harmless. Ryan crossed from cover. Gunfire followed. By the time Caleb reached him, there had been nothing left to argue about. The official report came weeks later. Caleb read it once, then again. Petty Officer Ryan Keller departed assigned position without authorization, contributing to operational breakdown. Caleb never challenged it. He had been injured, medicated, barely sleeping. Every time he tried to reconstruct the mission, pieces changed places, so he accepted the simplest version. Ryan moved because Caleb failed. Ryan died because Caleb needed saving. Caleb carried that version into physical therapy, into his marriage, into every nightmare, eventually into divorce court, eventually into the Ford pickup. Bear pressed his body against Caleb's leg. Caleb looked down. "I'm here." The dog remained against him. "I'm here." Laura had followed, but stopped several feet away. She did not ask what he had seen. Caleb appreciated that. After a while, he said, "Ever see a report become more real than what actually happened?" Laura leaned against the corridor wall. "Every investigator has. What do you do? Find another source." Caleb looked toward the watchroom. "And if there isn't one, then you don't pretend uncertainty is proof." The answer hurt more than he expected. Caleb rubbed Bear's neck. "I knew somebody," Laura waited. "Ryan Keller, SEAL, my team." Caleb swallowed. "He died on a hostage rescue 8 years ago. I'm sorry. The report said he left his position." Laura said nothing. "I never challenged it." "Why?" Caleb stared toward the dark end of the corridor. "Because I thought he moved because of me." That was all he could say. He returned to the watchroom. George was examining another document. "I found something." Caleb sat. George turned the page around. A transfer control log contained Pierce's initials beside several serial numbers. Next to them, in different handwriting, was a notation, "Hold for private contract review." No authorization number followed. "Private contract?" Caleb asked. "That's the problem." George tapped the page. There shouldn't have been private review of these assemblies before disposition. Below the notation was another set of initials. C. H. Charles Holloway. Caleb looked toward the hidden battery. What happened to Pierce after the second complaint? George opened a chronology. Last confirmed duty appearance, November 3rd, 1945. Then, nothing. Family, parents in Spokane. Both died believing their son had deserted. The sentence landed quietly. That made it worse. Caleb imagined 2 people growing old beneath a question they could never answer, maybe defending their son at first, then doubting, then wondering whether love had blinded them. Andrew Pierce had not only died behind a wall, his name had died outside it. Bear came to Caleb and placed his muzzle on his thigh. Caleb rested one hand between the dog's ears. He thought about Ryan's family. He had attended the funeral. Back row dress uniform. He remembered Ryan's younger sister standing beside the casket, Megan, 20-something then, red eyes, straight back. Caleb had left before she could reach him. He told himself his presence would make things harder. He had become skilled at turning disappearance into kindness. George closed the file. We still need the transfer list. Caleb looked at Pierce's 2 complaints. Where would it be? If Pierce hid a copy, maybe here. If the Navy kept one, archives. If someone destroyed it. George stopped. Caleb finished. Then Pierce stays a thief, officially perhaps. George looked at him. Caleb's voice was quiet. No more, perhaps. He stood and walked toward the eastern battery. Bear followed. At the threshold of the hidden chamber, Caleb stopped behind the evidence tape. The place where Pierce had been found was empty now. Only numbered markers remained. Caleb imagined the officer sitting there in darkness, 31 years old, knowing someone outside was rewriting his life, knowing he might never get the chance to correct it. Caleb had spent years believing dead men could not be helped. Fort Alder was beginning to challenge that belief. Behind him, George said, "There's something else." Caleb turned. George held one final sheet. Pierce's second complaint names the officer responsible for authorizing the post-war inventory review. Charles Holloway? Oh. Holloway processed the paperwork. George stepped closer. The authorizing officer's name is missing from this copy. The line was physically cut from the original before it was microfilmed. Caleb stared at the rectangular absence on the page. Someone had not merely lost the name, someone had removed it. George lowered the document, which means whoever Pierce accused may have mattered more than Charles Holloway. Outside, thunder rolled over the Pacific. Bear looked toward the sealed equipment chamber. Caleb looked at the missing line. For the first time, the mystery felt larger than Grant Holloway and far more deliberate. Andrew Pierce had reported a theft. Someone had erased the person he accused. Then Pierce himself had disappeared. Caleb rested one hand on Bear's shoulder. 8 years ago, he had allowed one dead teammate's story to close because he had been too broken to keep asking questions. He would not do it twice. "We find the transfer list," Caleb said. George nodded. And then? Caleb looked toward the place where Andrew Pierce had waited 80 years for someone to listen. "Then we give a dead officer the chance I never gave Ryan." The words stayed with him through the night. By morning, the storm had moved east toward the Olympic Mountains, leaving Greyhaven Point beneath a hard silver sky. Snow covered the higher ridges beyond the cattle country, while the Pacific below Fort Alder remained dark and restless. Caleb woke before sunrise on an Army surplus cot in the old barracks. His knee hurt, his back hurt, his hands still carried small cuts from working around the fort. Bear slept beside him on 2 folded blankets, one paw twitching through whatever old battlefield his dreams had taken him back to. Caleb watched him for a moment. 9 years old, gray beginning around the muzzle, still ready to follow him into any darkness. "You deserve a better retirement." Bear opened one eye. Caleb reached for the last can of dog food. There were 2 left. For Caleb, there was half a loaf of bread, peanut butter, 3 cans of soup, and $11 from the 71 he had possessed before buying Fort Alder. He laughed quietly. "Technically, you're richer than I am." Bear's tail struck the blanket once. Around 10, Caleb heard tires outside. Not a state vehicle. A black SUV came through the rusted gate and stopped near the old ammunition loading platform. Grant Holloway stepped out alone. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a blue work shirt, dark jeans, and boots that looked expensive without trying to. Wind pushed his brown hair across his forehead. He carried no generator this time, no propane, only a leather briefcase. Bear rose, Caleb noticed. "Easy," Grant approached slowly. "Morning, depends who's asking." Grant glanced toward Bear. "Still judging me? He hasn't issued the final report." Grant smiled, but there was less ease in it than before. "I heard about Pierce." Caleb's expression did not change. Everyone has. The whole town's talking about it. The whole town wasn't interested when he was bones behind a wall. Grant looked toward the fort. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Grant raised the briefcase slightly. I came to make you another offer. Caleb almost turned away. You already tried. 30,000. I remember. Isn't 30. They went into the old observation room where one narrow window faced the Pacific. Bear followed. Grant set the briefcase on a concrete ledge and opened it. There was no cash inside. Contracts, bank verification, a cashier's check authorization. Read the number twice, $100,000. He looked up. Grant rested both hands against the ledge. $100,000 for Fort Alder. Caleb stared at him. Why? Because 3 days from now, maybe tomorrow, federal preservation restrictions could freeze any private transfer for months or years, and you want it before that happens. I want the property. Why? Grant looked toward the sea. My family has been in Greyhaven for 4 generations. I've wanted to stabilize this place for years. You could have bought it for $50. Grant's jaw tightened. I didn't know the county was going to dump it through a symbolic transfer. You were at the hearing after you signed. Caleb remembered. Grant had indeed arrived later. That mattered. Maybe. Grant pushed the documents closer. This isn't a trick. Caleb studied the check authorization. $100,000. The number seemed unreal inside a room where rainwater gathered in buckets. Grant continued. You could rent an apartment in Port Angeles for a year and still have money left. Caleb said nothing. You could get your knee looked at properly. Nothing. You could buy a truck that doesn't sound like it's negotiating with God every time it starts. Caleb almost smiled. Then Grant looked at Bear, and you could take care of him. That landed. Grant must have seen it. He's 9, Caleb. I know how old my dog is. I'm not insulting you. Grant's voice softened. I'm saying old working dogs get expensive. Dental work, arthritis, imaging, emergencies. Kay looked at Bear. Bear stood near the doorway, watching both men. A memory came without permission. 2 months earlier, a veterinary clinic. Caleb sitting beneath fluorescent lights while a receptionist explained the cost of imaging Bear's rear hip. Caleb had asked whether they could wait. The veterinarian had said yes, for now. Caleb hated those 2 words, for now. Grant tapped the contract. You don't owe this fort anything. Caleb looked at him. Pierce might. Pierce is a federal matter now. His name isn't. That isn't your responsibility. Caleb felt irritation rise. Grant saw it and lifted a hand. I'm not saying forget him. Sounds close. I'm saying you don't have to destroy yourself proving something government investigators can prove without you. Caleb turned toward the window. Below them, waves struck the cliff. $100,000. A bed. Heat. A shower that belonged to him. Veterinary care for Bear. Physical therapy. Maybe a phone plan that did not shut off every time money ran thin. Maybe clothes that did not smell like damp concrete. Maybe an address. The last one hurt most. An address meant paperwork. Paperwork meant Lina. He imagined writing it beneath his name. Caleb Morgan, apartment 4B, somewhere ordinary. Somewhere his daughter could visit without walking through a ruined gun battery. Grant's voice came from behind him. You've spent enough years surviving. Caleb turned. Grant looked sincere. That was the problem. If Grant had threatened him, Caleb could have refused easily. If he had mocked him, easier still. But kindness made dangerous doors look reasonable. Caleb looked at the contract. Give me an hour, Grant nodded. I'll wait outside. He closed the briefcase but left the contract on the ledge. Then he walked toward the courtyard. Bear watched him leave. Caleb lowered himself onto an old ammunition crate. His knee sent a hot ache through his thigh. $100,000. He took out his phone. For several seconds, he considered calling Laura. Instead, he opened Lena's contact. He did not call. What would he say? Your father bought a fort for $50 and might sell it for $100,000 because his dog needs an X-ray. It sounded absurd. His entire life sounded absurd when reduced to facts. Bear came over. Caleb scratched behind his ear. What do you think? Bear looked toward the courtyard. That's helpful. Caleb stood. Come on. Grant was near the SUV, speaking on his phone. When he saw Caleb, he ended the call. Decision? Caleb held the unsigned contract. I need one answer. Okay, did your grandfather know Andrew Pierce? Grant's expression changed. Not fear, pain, perhaps. My grandfather died when I was 12. That wasn't the question. Grant looked toward the ocean. My family said Charles worked logistics here. Pierce filed complaints. Charles marked them resolved. Grant exhaled. I heard that yesterday. From who? County attorney. Anything else? No. Caleb watched him. Grant met his gaze. I am not my grandfather. I know. Then don't look at me like I'm standing trial for 1945. I'm looking at you like a man offering a homeless stranger $100,000 for something he could have bought last week for $50. Grant's face hardened, because last week it was a collapsing fort. Today it's national news. That's a better answer. Grant shook his head. You know what? Keep it if you want. Freeze here, proving some dead officer was honorable. Maybe they'll put your name on a plaque. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Now you sound like yourself. Grant stared at him. Then Bear moved. Not toward Grant. Toward the SUV, his nose dropped to the gravel. Bear, the shepherd, ignored him. He walked around the rear of the vehicle and stopped near the passenger side tire. A growl formed deep in his chest. Grant turned. What's wrong with him? Caleb approached. Bear sniffed the tire, then the wheel well. Something red stained the tread. Caleb crouched. His knee protested. He touched the dried material with one finger. Clay, not the dark coastal soil around Fort Alder. Red clay. He knew exactly where he had seen it, the abandoned military service road beyond the eastern ridge. A route closed behind a rusted county barrier. A route Georgia's 1944 map showed running toward the rear defense perimeter. Caleb stood slowly. When were you on the service road? Grant went still. What? East Ridge. Old military road. I wasn't. Caleb pointed toward the tire. That's red clay. So Fort Road is crushed basalt. Town roads are gray gravel. Black Cedar Side is dark loam. Grant glanced at the tire, a fraction too quickly. Caleb saw it. I haven't been up there, Grant said. Bear growled again. Grant stepped backward. Control your dog. Caleb looked at Bear. Then at the SUV. The rear tire was not the only place carrying red clay. A thin streak marked the lower edge of the bumper, fresh enough that yesterday's rain had not washed it away. Caleb's attention shifted to Grant's boots. Clean. Too clean. You came here this morning from town? Yes, straight here, then explain the clay. Grant's face closed. The warmth disappeared, not replaced by rage, by calculation. That frightened Caleb more. Grant took the contract from Caleb's hand. $100,000. Caleb said nothing. You'll never get another offer like it. Probably not. Think carefully. I am. Grant returned the contract to the briefcase. He shut the brass clasps. Click, click. The sound echoed across the old courtyard. You don't know what you're getting into, Grant said. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Is that advice? Grant looked toward Fort Alder, then toward Bear. I hope so. He entered the SUV. The engine started. Bear remained beside Caleb as the vehicle backed around and drove through the gate. They watched until it disappeared down the coastal road. For a while, only the ocean moved. Caleb looked at the red clay left behind on the gravel where the tire had rested. Then he looked east, beyond Fort Alder. Forest covered the ridge. Somewhere behind those trees ran an abandoned military road that official county maps barely acknowledged. Grant Holloway had offered him enough money to leave, then lied about having been there. Caleb reached down and rested his hand against Bear's neck. The dog stopped growling. 30,000 when this place was worthless, Caleb said. Bear watched the empty gate. 100,000 after we found Pierce. Wind moved through the spruce trees. Caleb thought of Charles Holloway, the buried complaints, the missing name, the transfer list no one had found. Then he thought of the red clay. Grant had wanted Fort Alder, but perhaps the question was no longer why. Perhaps the better question was what he needed to reach before Caleb did. Bear turned toward the eastern ridge. Caleb followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond the trees, hidden beneath 80 years of forest and family silence, an old military road was waiting, and Grant Holloway had already been on it. Caleb did not follow him. 10 years earlier, he would have. He would have taken Bear into the timber before sunset, found the service road, read the tire marks, and kept moving until somebody gave him a reason to stop. But 10 years earlier, his knee had been whole, Bear had been young, and Caleb had still believed speed could solve most problems. Now he photographed the red clay. Then he called Laura Bennett. She arrived 40 minutes later. Laura crouched beside the tire marks Grant's SUV had left in the gravel and studied Caleb's photographs before looking toward the eastern ridge. You confronted him, asked a question, which means yes. He lied. That doesn't make him guilty of anything except lying. Caleb looked at her. People usually lie because the truth costs more. Laura stood. That's why investigators collect evidence before conclusions. Bear sat beside Caleb. Laura pointed at him. See? He agrees with me. He thinks you have food. Smart dog. She photographed the clay and requested a state unit check the abandoned service road from the inland side. Caleb expected her to tell him to stay away from it. She did. Twice. By afternoon, George Palmer had returned with 3 more archive boxes. The old historian had become increasingly offended by 1940s filing systems. I have reached a professional conclusion, he announced, dropping a folder onto the table, which is, the United States won the war despite its paperwork. Caleb almost smiled. George removed his glasses. Then his expression changed. There's someone here to see you. Caleb looked toward the entrance. A woman stood beneath the concrete archway, late 30s, dark brown hair tied behind her head, green canvas jacket, jeans, hiking boots still wet from the road. She carried a large brown envelope beneath one arm. Caleb knew her before his mind accepted it. Megan Keller, Ryan's younger sister. The last time Caleb had seen her, she had been standing beneath a cemetery tent while rain gathered along the edge of her brother's folded flag. 8 years had changed her. Grief had not. Megan looked at him, then at Bear. Bear recognized her first. His tail moved. Once, twice, he walked toward her. Megan dropped to one knee. Oh, Bear! The dog pressed his muzzle against her chest. She wrapped both arms around his neck. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Caleb looked away, Megan buried her face against the shepherd's fur. You got old. Bear leaned harder against her, so did I. When she stood, her eyes were wet. Her expression toward Caleb was not warm, but it was not hatred either. That would have been easier. I saw you on the news, she said. Caleb nodded. Hard to miss. Homeless Navy SEAL buys $50 fort. Reporters like adjectives. They also said Bear found a dead Navy officer. He did. Megan looked toward the Eastern Battery. Ryan would have loved that. Caleb's throat tightened. He would have said Bear finally got a competent handler. Megan almost smiled. Almost. Then the old hurt returned. You stopped answering us. Caleb did not defend himself. My mother called you. I know. I called you. I know. We weren't asking you to explain the mission. Caleb stared at the concrete floor. We just didn't want to lose two people. There it was. No anger, no accusation shouted across a room. Just a sentence spoken quietly enough to enter every place Caleb had spent 8 years trying to lock. Megan held out the brown envelope. I found this after Mom moved. Caleb did not take it. What is it? Something Ryan mailed home. When? Before the mission. Caleb finally accepted the envelope. It had already been opened. Inside was a smaller military mailer, yellowed along one edge. Megan said, Mom couldn't throw his things away. Neither could I. Caleb removed a photograph. 3 figures stood beneath a washed-out Afghan sky, Ryan Keller on the left, Caleb on the right, Bear between them. Bear had been younger then, lean and sharp, his sable coat dark beneath his working harness. Ryan was smiling. Caleb was not. Caleb remembered the moment. They had been outside a temporary operations building. Ryan had complained that Caleb looked like a man posing for a driver's license after a divorce. Caleb had told him to shut up. Ryan had laughed harder. The memory struck with such clarity Caleb had to sit. Megan pointed toward the back. Turn it over. Caleb did. Ryan's handwriting crossed the photograph. If Morgan disappears after this one, go find him. He always thinks leaving makes things easier for everyone else. Caleb stopped breathing. The watchroom became too small. Bear came to him. Caleb felt the dog's shoulder against his leg. He read the words again, then again. Ryan had written them before the mission, before the gunfire, before Caleb's injury, before Ryan left his assigned position. Why didn't you give me this? Megan's face tightened. We tried to find you. Caleb looked up. You changed numbers, left treatment, stopped answering your old team. Your landlord said you moved. Don't. She shook her head. Don't tell me you were protecting us. Caleb fell silent. Megan's voice trembled now. Ryan died. Then you decided for everybody that losing you too would somehow be easier. I wasn't right. No. I know that now. Do you? Caleb looked at Bear. I think I'm starting to. Megan wiped beneath one eye. I'm not here to forgive you. I didn't ask. Good. She drew a breath. I'm here because Ryan asked us to find you. Caleb turned the photograph over again. The words remained, simple, almost joking, terrible. George appeared in the doorway. He hesitated. Caleb. Caleb looked up. George held several photocopies. His face had lost all humor. What happened? I found another transfer record. Laura had returned from outside and entered behind him. George spread the document on the table. It was dated October 1945. Equipment Transfer Authorization, Fort Alder. 42 navigation assemblies. The serial sequence matched the units found behind the steel wall. Caleb stood. That's it? Not the complete transfer list. But it's closer. George pointed to the lower section. Charles Holloway's signature. Megan came beside them. So Grant's grandfather? Yes. George tapped the signature. But look at the notation. Caleb leaned closer. Charles Holloway had signed as civilian logistics witness, not authorizing officer, witness. George placed another archive sheet beside it. Charles wasn't senior enough to approve diversion of restricted equipment. Caleb frowned. Then who was? George said nothing. Caleb followed his eyes downward. There was a second signature, faded, partly obscured by an old filing stamp, but readable. Edward Morganalt, CMDR, U.S. Naval Reserve Logistics. Oversight. Caleb stared at the surname, Morgan. The room seemed to lose sound. Son looked at him. Caleb? He did not answer. He knew that name, not from Fort Alder, from childhood, from photographs stored in his father's hallway. A stern man in navy whites standing beside a flag. A man Caleb's father had spoken about with the reverence families reserved for ancestors who had become legends before anyone still alive was old enough to question them. My grandfather, Caleb said. George removed his glasses. I checked the service number. Caleb looked at him. George's voice was quiet. Edward Morgan was your grandfather. The Pacific struck the cliff below. Caleb stared at the signature. All day he had been thinking about Grant Holloway's bloodline. Charles Holloway, Grant's lies, Grant's red clay. It had been easy to suspect another man's family. Now his own name sat on the same page. Megan touched the edge of the table. What does the signature mean? George answered carefully. Right now? Only that Edward Morgan authorized a transfer connected to the missing equipment. Could he have been helping Pierce? Possibly. Could he have been stealing it? George had looked at Caleb. Possibly. Caleb stepped away. His grandfather had been a family story. War hero. Officer. Patriot. The man who helped build Greyhaven's post-war shipping business. Caleb remembered being 7 years old and touching the glass over Edward Morgan's medals. His father had said, "That's where our name comes from." Now that name was attached to 42 devices hidden behind a dead officer. Bear followed Caleb into the corridor. Megan came after them but stopped several feet away. Caleb stared toward the eastern battery. Funny. What? I thought this was Grant's family secret. Megan said nothing. Caleb looked at Ryan's photograph in his hand. For years, he had believed one version of Ryan's death, because it had been written in an official report. Now Andrew Pierce had taught him how dangerous official versions could become, and Edward Morgan was about to teach him something worse. The truth did not care whose name you wanted to protect. Bear nudged Caleb's hand. Caleb looked down. The dog had no interest in surnames, no interest in medals, no interest in family reputation. Bear only knew whether Caleb was standing or falling. Caleb placed his palm against the shepherd's head. Behind them, Laura's phone rang. She answered. Her posture changed almost immediately. When? A pause. Don't touch anything. Photograph the entire site. Caleb turned. Laura ended the call. The unit reached the old service road, and they found fresh tire tracks. Grant. Caleb waited. Laura continued. They also found something else. What? An old concrete drainage entrance beneath the ridge. George stepped closer. Military? Looks like it. Where does it go? Laura looked toward Fort Alder's eastern wall. We don't know. A cold gust moved through the corridor. Bear's head rose, then he turned away from them, slowly, toward the mountainside of the fort. His ears came forward. Caleb knew that posture. He had seen it at the welded blast door. Bear took 3 steps into the darkness and stopped. Then he looked back. Caleb folded Ryan's photograph carefully and placed it inside his jacket. One dead man had left him a message about disappearing. Another had left him a message about theft. And now his own grandfather's signature connected them to a mystery buried beneath Greyhaven Point. Caleb picked up his flashlight. Laura saw him. "Don't. I'm not going to the service road." Caleb, he looked toward Bear. The shepherd was staring into the dark corridor. "I'm following my dog." Bear turned and began walking deeper into Fort Alder, toward this mountain. Caleb followed with the flashlight held low. Laura came behind him. "Following your dog is still following something. Then arrest him. He's more cooperative." George and Megan remained in the watchroom, while Caleb and Laura moved through the Eastern Service corridor. Bear passed the chamber where Andrew Pierce had been found, without slowing. That caught Caleb's attention. Whatever Bear sensed now was somewhere else. The corridor narrowed beneath the ridge. Concrete replaced the older stonework, and rusted pipes disappeared into walls stained dark by decades of moisture. Then Bear stopped. A ventilation grill sat near floor level. Caleb crouched. It looked ordinary. 6 bolts, heavy steel, layers of paint. But Bear pushed his nose against the lower edge. Caleb felt it too. Air. Cold this time. Moving inward. Laura knelt beside him. "Blueprint shows this ventilation line ending 30 feet inside the ridge. Solid rock again? Apparently Greyhaven has a complicated relationship with that phrase." Bear scratched once, then the lights died. Every temporary lamp inside Fort Alder vanished at the same instant. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Megan called Caleb's name from somewhere behind them. Caleb froze. For one fraction of a second, he was not in Washington. Heat, dust, a dark compound. A radio voice breaking apart, a flash behind a doorway. His breathing shortened. His hand searched instinctively for a weapon that had not been there for years. Then Bear pressed against him, shoulder to shin, solid, warm, present. Caleb closed his eyes. Concrete, Pacific Ocean, Fort Alder, November. Bear, not Afghanistan. "I'm good." Laura's flashlight clicked on. She did not ask whether he was. Her radio crackled. "Exterior unit to Bennett. Generators down. Looks deliberate." Laura's expression hardened. "Lock the gate. Nobody enters or leaves without identification." Looked at the grill. Bear was already listening again. Then came a sound. Faint, metal against stone. From behind it, Laura heard it too. She raised one finger. Silence. Another scrape. Not from the fort, from inside the mountain. George appeared at the corridor entrance carrying a lantern. The backup generator cable has been cut. Caleb stood. "Get Megan into the western battery." Megan stepped into view behind George. "I'm standing right here. That's why I said it where you could hear me. I'm not—" Laura cut in. "He's right. West Battery, now." Something struck metal behind the grill. Bear growled. Caleb removed the first bolt. Laura stared at him. "What are you doing? If somebody's behind this wall, I'd rather know where they'll come out." The grill came loose. Behind it was not a narrow ventilation duct. It was a concrete shaft, large enough for a man to crawl through. George lifted the lantern. "That is not on any plan I've seen." Caleb aimed his flashlight inside. The shaft descended several feet, then opened into darkness. Bear pushed forward. "No," Caleb caught his harness. The dog looked back. Not first. Bear appeared offended. Laura called for the exterior troopers. Only Static answered. The storm outside had intensified so quickly that rain had turned to wet snow, blowing almost horizontally across the headland. Wind shook the old fort, then a heavy metallic sound echoed from inside the shaft. A door, opening. Caleb switched off his flashlight. Laura did the same. They waited. A narrow beam appeared far below, moving. Someone was coming toward them. Caleb backed away from the grill. "West Battery," he whispered to George. This time George did not argue. He took Megan and disappeared. Laura positioned herself beside the corridor corner. Caleb stayed opposite her. Bear stood between them. The beam grew brighter. Footsteps. 2 sets. A man's whisper. "List has to be here." Caleb's eyes met Laura's. The transfer list. The first intruder emerged from the shaft wearing a dark waterproof jacket and a face covering. The second followed. Both stopped when Bear growled. The sound filled the corridor. "Don't move," Laura ordered. The first man turned. Everything happened at once. He slammed backward into the shaft. The second threw something into the darkness. Caleb heard it strike concrete. A sharp electronic chirp followed. His body understood before his mind did. Down. The blast was small but violent. Concrete cracked inside the shaft. Dust punched through the grill opening. Laura fell behind the corner. Caleb hit the floor. Bear did not. The shepherd lunged for Caleb's harnessless shoulder, caught his coat in his teeth, and pulled. A slab of concrete dropped from overhead. It struck the floor exactly where Caleb's head had been. The corridor disappeared into gray dust. Caleb heard nothing for several seconds except a high ringing. Then Bear barked. Once. Close. Caleb touched him. "Good boy." Laura emerged through the dust, coughing. "You hurt?" "No. Dog." Caleb ran his hands over Bear. No blood. One masked man had vanished into the shaft. The second lay against the wall, stunned by the collapse. Laura reached him first. "Hands," he hesitated. Bear stepped forward. The man put both hands where Laura could see them. "Excellent decision," she said. The explosion had damaged the shaft, but it had also torn away a section of concrete facing. Behind it, Caleb saw something impossible. A tunnel, not ventilation, a full military passage. Steel support ribs ran into the mountain. Old electrical conduit followed one wall. Narrow rails disappeared beneath dirt and fallen stone. George returned, despite being told not to. He stared. "Good Lord," Laura looked at him. "I specifically sent you away. I brought backup." Megan stood behind him holding a fire extinguisher. Laura closed her eyes briefly. "Of course you did." Caleb aimed his light down the passage. On the wall, beneath rust and mineral stains, white military lettering remained visible. Auxiliary Supply Route B. George moved closer. This could explain everything. What? Fort Alder wasn't isolated. He pointed inland. During the war, they may have moved sensitive material through a protected supply tunnel instead of the coastal road. Megan looked toward the darkness. "Where does it end?" Caleb already suspected. Black Cedar Ranch. George looked at him. The old ranch lay beyond the eastern ridge, surrounded by pasture and dense cedar forest. Its current owner leased most of the land for cattle, but the original property had once bordered the military reservation, and the abandoned service road ran directly behind it. Laura's radio finally came alive. Troopers were coming through the outer corridor. She secured the captured man and pulled down his face covering. Caleb did not recognize him. Mid-40s, weathered face, gray beard, fear in his eyes. Laura searched his jacket and found a prepaid phone, plastic restraints, and a photocopy of Fort Alder's 1945 internal map. A red circle marked the watchroom, another marked the Eastern Battery. Written beside it, transfer list. Caleb crouched in front of him. "Who sent you?" Laura gave Caleb a warning look. The man stared at Bear instead. Bear's lips lifted slightly. The man swallowed. "We weren't supposed to hurt anybody." Caleb's voice remained quiet. "Who?" No answer. Laura stepped closer. "You entered an active state investigation site, cut power, and used an explosive device inside an occupied structure. This is the moment where silence stops helping you." The man's breathing changed. Caleb saw it. Fear was winning. "Holloway," the man said. Caleb felt something cold settle inside him. "Grant Holloway?" The man nodded. "He paid. For what? Keeping people quiet, watching the fort, finding out what you knew." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Did he send you tonight?" The man shook his head immediately. "No, don't lie, I'm not." "Then who did?" "I don't know," Bear growled. The man pressed himself harder against the wall. "Swear." Holloway paid for silence. Laura leaned closer. "What does that mean?" "He paid us months ago to stay away from the old service road. Paid people not to talk about seeing him up there. Said it was family business. And tonight? Different call. From who?" Voice was altered. "Cash drop. Instructions." "What instructions?" "Get the transfer list before Morgan finds it." Caleb stared at him. The man glanced toward the tunnel, then said the words that changed the shape of everything. "Holloway paid for silence." He swallowed. He didn't order this. Outside, the storm struck Fort Alder with enough force to shake snow from the broken observation slit. Caleb looked toward the dark tunnel. For days, Grant Holloway had occupied the center of his suspicion. Charles Holloway had processed Pierce's complaints. Grant had lied about the military road. Grant had offered $100,000 for the fort. All of it still mattered. But now someone else knew about the transfer list. Someone willing to cut power. Someone willing to send men through a forgotten tunnel. Someone who specifically referred to Caleb by name. Megan stepped closer. "Caleb," he turned. She held Ryan's photograph. It must have slipped partly from his jacket during the blast. She handed it back. On the reverse, Ryan's handwriting remained intact beneath a coating of concrete dust. "If Morgan disappears after this one, go find him." Caleb wiped the dust away with his thumb. "Morgan, not Caleb, Morgan." His gaze shifted toward George, Edward Morgan. George's face became still. Laura understood immediately. The signature. Caleb nodded. The tunnel beneath Fort Alder suddenly felt colder. The mystery was no longer pointing only toward the Holloways. It was turning toward his own family. A trooper called from inside the passage. "Investigator!" Laura moved toward him. "What? We found tracks. Fresh? Very." The trooper raised his flashlight. And tire impressions near the inland entrance. Caleb looked into the tunnel. "Black cedar?" "Looks that way." Bear walked to the opening. He sniffed the cold air coming from beneath the mountain. Then he turned toward Caleb. The old shepherd's face held no fear, only expectation. Caleb placed Ryan's photograph back inside his jacket. Grant Holloway had lied. Someone else had attacked. His grandfather's name was on the transfer. And beneath the pasture east of Fort Alder ran a secret road through the mountain that had survived nearly 80 years without appearing on a county blueprint. Caleb had spent half his life believing the most dangerous thing in darkness was what waited ahead. He knew better now. Sometimes it was what followed your family name out of the past. By sunrise, the storm had moved inland. Greyhaven Point emerged beneath a pale winter sky, washed clean on the surface and damaged underneath. Wet snow clung to the cedar branches above Fort Alder. The Pacific rolled below the cliffs in long gray lines. Across the eastern ridge, Black Cedar Ranch lay beneath a thin white blanket, its pastures separated by dark fences and stands of timber. State police sealed both ends of the tunnel. The captured intruder was taken to Port Angeles. The second man escaped through the inland entrance before troopers reached Black Cedar. Caleb spent the morning answering questions. Then George called him into the watchroom. The archivist had not slept. His gray hair stood in several directions. His shirt sleeves were rolled above the elbows, and 4 coffee cups surrounded him like casualties. On the table sat a laptop. Beside it was a printed image from microfilm. Laura stood behind George. Megan sat near the window. Nobody spoke when Caleb entered. Bear came in beside him. Caleb stopped. "What?" George looked at the screen. "I found the missing testimony." Caleb pulled out a chair. "Where?" "Not Greyhaven." George enlarged the scanned document. After the war, duplicate naval administrative records were sent to several regional repositories. Somebody searched the Washington files decades ago. They either missed this copy or didn't know it existed. Where was it? Naval records transferred through San Francisco in 1947. Misfiled under civilian procurement disputes. Caleb looked at the document. Who gave the testimony? A supply clerk named Thomas Avery. George's voice had changed. The dry humor was gone. This was recorded in February 1946. Laura placed a hand on the back of the empty chair across from Caleb. "You need to hear all of it." Caleb nodded. George began. Avery had worked at Fort Alder during the final months of the war. His statement described irregular movement of navigation assemblies after Japan's surrender. 42 units. Serial numbers changed. Transfer records rewritten. Private defense representatives visiting after normal duty hours. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. George continued. Now Charles Holloway. Caleb waited. Avery says Charles discovered the discrepancies. Caleb looked up. What? He wasn't running the diversion. George turned the page. He was helping Pierce document it. Silence filled the room. Caleb thought of Grant, the red clay, the $100,000 offer. He processed Pierce's complaints. Yes, marked them resolved, under instruction, from who? George did not answer. He moved his finger lower on the testimony. Caleb read the name himself, Lieutenant Commander Edward Morgan. For several seconds, the letters became meaningless shapes. George spoke quietly. Your grandfather supervised the logistics office. Caleb kept reading. Avery testified that Edward Morgan ordered equipment removed from official transfer inventory and redirected through a civilian procurement channel connected to private defense buyers. Charles Holloway objected. Andrew Pierce began documenting serial numbers. Then Pierce threatened to bypass the local chain of command. 3 days later, he disappeared. Caleb's voice was barely audible. Did Edward kill him? No evidence says that. George emphasized every word. We know Edward ran the diversion. We know Pierce was exposing it. We do not know how Pierce died. Caleb stood and walked to the observation slit. Outside, sunlight touched the snow on the Olympic peaks. He remembered his grandfather's photograph. Navy whites, perfect posture, medals, his father's voice. That's where our name comes from. Caleb almost laughed. Behind him, Megan said, "A family story isn't a family." He turned. She held Ryan's photograph between both hands. "It's just a story people agree to keep telling." Caleb looked at her. "You learned that from Ryan?" "No." Her expression softened slightly. "I learned it after he died." Laura's phone vibrated. She checked the message, then looked at Caleb. "We found who still has access to the old Morgan family records." Caleb already knew. His uncle Richard. Judge Richard Morgan had been part of Caleb's childhood in the way distant mountains were part of Greyhaven. Always there, impressive from far away. 67 now, Richard had spent decades first as a prosecutor, then on the county bench. He spoke at Memorial Day ceremonies. He raised money for veterans' housing. His photograph hung inside the courthouse, and when Caleb's marriage collapsed, Richard had been one of the few relatives who did not lecture him. He had paid for 3 weeks at a roadside motel. Caleb still remembered the envelope, $800, no note, no judgment, just enough to keep him out of the truck during January. "Where is he?" Caleb asked. Laura's expression tightened. "On his way here." 20 minutes later, a dark green sedan stopped outside Fort Alder. Richard Morgan climbed out alone. He wore a long black overcoat over a gray suit. His white hair was combed back from a broad forehead. Age had softened his body, but not his presence. He entered the watchroom and saw the testimony. Everything in his face changed. Not surprise, recognition. Caleb understood immediately. "You knew." Richard removed his gloves. "Leb." "How long?" Richard glanced at Laura. "I'd prefer to discuss family matters privately." Laura did not move. This stopped being only a family matter around 1945. Richard looked back at Caleb. "I knew there were allegations." "Don't." Caleb's voice was low. "Don't give me courtroom language." Richard's jaw tightened. Caleb pushed the testimony across the table. "Did Edward Morgan steal those assemblies?" Richard looked at the paper, then closed his eyes. The word entered Caleb more quietly than he expected. No explosion, no rage, just something old collapsing. "Did you know Pierce was innocent?" I suspected. "Suspected, Caleb. This happened before I was born. You knew enough to hide it." Richard's eyes opened. I knew enough to understand what disclosure would do. To who? Everyone. Richard gestured toward the fort. "Your grandfather became part of this town's identity. The Morgan Shipping Company employed hundreds of families after the war. Scholarships were funded in his name. Veterans programs, the courthouse restoration. So history is not clean." George spoke from the table. "That is usually the argument made by people who benefited from the dirt." Richard ignored him. Caleb stepped closer. "Pierce died labeled a thief." Richard's voice sharpened. "And correcting that requires destroying every good thing built afterward. Truth doesn't destroy the good. You don't know that." "Noda," Caleb looked at him. "But I know lies don't make it good." Richard studied his nephew for a long moment. Then something in him changed. The judge disappeared. The uncle remained. "I helped you." Caleb felt the blow. Richard continued. "When your own father stopped answering your calls, I answered. When you were sleeping behind that truck stop outside Sequim, I found you. When you wouldn't take money, I left it at the motel. I remember. I never asked you for anything." Caleb's throat tightened. "Until now." Richard looked toward the eastern battery. "Give me the transfer list if you find it." Laura straightened. Richard raised one hand. I'm not asking anyone to destroy anything. What are you asking? Caleb said. Let the dead rest. Caleb stared at him. Pierce has been resting for 80 years. You know what I mean. Yeah, Caleb stepped closer. You mean let the lie rest? Richard's composure cracked. You think truth is always mercy? No. You think Pierce's family will be healed? They're gone. Edward is gone. Charles Holloway is gone. The war is gone. Then why are people breaking into tunnels? Richard went silent. There, Caleb saw it. A fraction of fear. You know who's doing it. Richard looked away. Laura spoke. Judge Morgan, you should consider very carefully what you say next. Richard turned toward her. I am not speaking as a judge. Caleb said. You're speaking as family. Richard looked at him. Caleb felt Bear move against his leg. That familiar weight, that reminder, present. Richard's voice softened. Your father worshipped Edward. Finding out what he did broke something in him. Do you understand? That's why he buried the records. That's why I kept them buried after he died. Caleb frowned. My father knew for years. Another family silence opened. Caleb thought of his father growing colder as Caleb got older. The long pauses whenever military service came up. The strange refusal to visit Fort Alder during school trips. Pieces shifted. Grant? Caleb asked. Richard hesitated. What about him? He knows something. Charles Holloway left documents proving he tried to help Pierce. Grant discovered them years ago. Caleb understood. He was protecting his grandfather and his family business, the 100,000. He wanted the fort controlled before those records surfaced. So Grant lied, but he wasn't sending men through that tunnel. Richard did not answer. Caleb moved closer. Was he? No. Laura's eyes sharpened. How can you be certain? Richard realized his mistake. Too late. Outside, Bear suddenly turned toward the courtyard. A vehicle door slammed somewhere beyond the wall, then another. Laura reached for her radio. Richard's face went pale. Caleb saw it. Who did you bring? No one, Bear growled, not at Richard, toward the eastern road. Laura moved to the window. 2 dark vehicles had stopped near the lower gate. Men stepped out. Not police. Richard whispered something. Caleb barely heard it. What? His uncle looked at him. I told them nobody was supposed to get hurt. The sentence emptied the room. Caleb stared at him. You? Richard shook his head. Not the tunnel. I only wanted the documents secured. By who? Private security. Laura's radio was already in her hand. Richard stepped toward Caleb. Listen to me. There is another copy. Caleb stopped. Another copy of what? The transfer list. Where? Richard looked toward the snowy ridge. Black Cedar Ranch. Megan stood. How do you know? Richard's eyes moved to her. Because Charles Holloway hid it there. George whispered. My God. Richard continued quickly. Grant found references to it, but never found the list itself. Your grandfather's records say Charles used an emergency cache beneath the old ranch office. Caleb's mind raced. Black Cedar, the tunnel, the red clay, the intruders, Richard's men, Grant's secret. 2 different groups searching for the same evidence. Who knows Megan is connected to Ryan? Richard asked suddenly. Caleb's blood went cold. Why? Rich looked toward the gate. Because the people I hired know George has been working with her. Megan's face changed. George looked at his satchel, the photocopies, the archive notes, the clues. Richard whispered, if they think either of them has the duplicate, Caleb was already moving. Bear moved with him. Laura called for state units. Outside, the first snow began falling again. Thin white flakes crossed the courtyard. Caleb reached the truck. Bear jumped into the passenger side despite his stiff rear legs. Caleb started the engine. It coughed once, twice, then caught. Megan ran toward him. "I'm coming." "No, Ryan told us to find you." "This isn't about Ryan." She looked directly at him. "Everything about you is still about Ryan." Caleb had no answer. Laura reached the truck. Black Cedar is 12 minutes by the Ridge Road. State units are coming from town. 12 minutes is a long time. "I know." She looked at Bear, then at Caleb. "Don't turn this into Afghanistan." Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He looked toward Richard Morgan standing alone beneath the fort arch. His uncle, the man who had once paid for his shelter, the man now asking him to bury another soldier's name. Caleb shifted into gear. "No," his voice was quiet. "This time I know what I'm fighting for." The truck turned toward the mountain road. Bear stood beside him, staring through the windshield as snow swallowed the trees ahead. And somewhere beyond those trees, beneath the pasture at Black Cedar Ranch, waited the piece of paper that could finally clear Andrew Pierce or disappear forever. Snow thickened as Caleb drove east. Caleb's stomach tightened. "He came here." Megan leaned forward from the back seat. "He must have left Fort Alder before us." Caleb stopped beside the barn. The driver's door of George's car stood open. No George, no lights in the farmhouse. Then Bear growled. Tire tracks crossed the snow. Presh, 2 vehicles, one set disappeared behind the barn. Caleb killed the engine. "Megan, lock the doors." She stared at him. "Caleb, please." That word changed her expression. She nodded. Caleb looked at Bear. "Stay." Bear's ears moved forward. "Bear, stay." The dog remained inside. Caleb stepped into the snow. His knee immediately reminded him that cold had arrived before he was ready for it. He ignored the pain. Near the farmhouse, a side door hung open. Caleb entered. "George?" Silence. The kitchen smelled of old wood and cold coffee. Papers covered the table. George's papers. Caleb saw a copy of the 1946 testimony, military maps, and a handwritten note. "Cellar, East Foundation. Holloway Cash." A floorboard creaked behind him. Caleb turned. George emerged from a pantry door, holding a fireplace poker. He lowered it. "Thank God. You all right? I am offended." "That sounds normal." "2 men arrived 5 minutes before me. I hid because I'm 72 and possess a highly developed respect for surviving stupidity." "Are they?" "Cellar." Caleb looked at the papers, the list, found it. George reached beneath his coat. A waterproof document sleeve appeared. Inside was a yellowed sheet. 42 serial numbers, transfer destination, private buyer codes, signatures, Edward Morgan, and beneath it, Andrew Pierce's handwritten notation, transfer not authorized. Original units secured pending naval review. There it was. Pierce had not stolen the equipment. He had secured it. Caleb stared at the sentence. 80 years. "One piece of paper." George said, "There's another copy." "Where?" "Megan has it." Caleb looked toward the truck. George gave the smallest smile. "I learned something from history. Never let one piece of paper carry the whole truth." A crash sounded below them. "The cellar." Caleb pushed George toward the rear door. "Go." "What about—" "Take the list." Caleb moved toward the cellar stairs, Then a voice came from below. Don't. A man climbed into view. Large, black jacket, handgun held low. Behind him came Richard Morgan. Caleb stopped. His uncle looked 20 years older than he had at Fort Alder. Caleb, you said nobody would get hurt. Richard looked at the armed man. I said put it away. The man did not. Plans changed. Richard's face tightened. Daniel, I said plans changed. Caleb understood. Richard had hired people he believed he could control. Now fear had taken command. Daniel pointed toward George. Give me the sleeve. George backed toward the door. Caleb stepped between them. No, Richard spoke sharply. Caleb, give it to him. Caleb looked at his uncle. You still think you can bury this? I think I can prevent one old crime from destroying 3 generations. Pierce already lost 3 generations. Richard's eyes flashed. You think your grandfather was a monster? I think he was guilty. You didn't know him. Neither did Pierce's parents after somebody sealed their son inside a mountain. Daniel raised the handgun. Enough. Outside, Bear barked. Caleb heard the truck door strike metal. His heart dropped. No. Bear appeared beyond the kitchen doorway. Snow covered his back. Megan shouted from outside. He forced the window. Of course he had. Bear entered. Caleb gave the command immediately. Bear, stay! The shepherd froze. Daniel turned toward him. Control that dog. He is controlled. Bear's eyes never left the weapon. Caleb could see the calculation happening inside the old animal. Distance, hands. Threat. Caleb knew it because they had once made those calculations together. Bear, the dog's torn ear angled toward him. Stay. Richard stepped forward. Daniel, lower the gun. Get the papers. George moved toward the rear door. Daniel swung the weapon toward him. Caleb shifted. Look at me. Daniel did. Good. Nobody here needs to get hurt. Then tell the old man to hand it over. You walk out now, you still have choices. Daniel laughed. You think you're still a SEAL? No. Caleb's voice remained calm. That's why I'm giving you the chance. Daniel's face hardened. The barrel lifted, not toward George, toward Caleb. Bear looked at Caleb, one heartbeat. Caleb saw the dog make his decision. Bear, stay! Bear broke command. He launched forward. The gunshot filled the farmhouse. Bear twisted in mid-stride. His body struck the floor. For a fraction of a second, Caleb's mind refused to understand. Then he saw red spreading through the fur above Bear's shoulder. Bear! The shepherd tried to rise. Daniel raised the gun again. Caleb moved. He drove into Daniel before the weapon leveled, trapping the man's arm against the wall. The gun fell across the floor. Caleb forced Daniel down and away from it. Years disappeared. Training returned without permission. Balance, control, threat, end it. Daniel stopped resisting. Caleb could have continued. He wanted to. Then Richard moved toward the fallen weapon. Caleb reached it first. He picked it up, pointed it. Richard froze. Snow blew through the open doorway behind him. Caleb, don't. His voice did not sound like his own. Richard lifted both hands. I didn't tell him to shoot. You brought him. I was trying to protect. Protect what? Caleb shouted now. A dead man's reputation? Richard flinched. Caleb's hands tightened around the weapon. The room narrowed. Richard became a shape, a threat, a cause. Caleb could hear Afghanistan again. Ryan, radio static, gunfire, the terrible clean simplicity of anger. Then another sound reached him, small, behind him, a whine, Bear. Caleb turned his head. The shepherd lay on his side. His front paws moved weakly against the floor. still trying to rise, still trying to reach Caleb. The rage cracked. Caleb looked at the gun in his hands, then at Richard, then at Bear. He lowered the weapon, not slowly, completely. He removed the magazine, cleared it, and set it far across the kitchen floor. Richard stared at him. Caleb dropped beside Bear. "Hey!" His hands began shaking. "Hey, buddy!" Bear's eyes found him. Blood darkened the floor beneath the shoulder. Megan rushed inside. She fell to her knees beside them. Oh, God. Pressure. She grabbed a clean dish towel. Caleb pressed it against the wound. Bear flinched. "I know." Caleb's voice broke. "No, I'm sorry." George was already calling emergency services. Daniel remained on the floor, stunned and holding his arm. Richard stood against the wall. Nobody looked at him. Bear's breathing came fast. Caleb leaned close. "You weren't supposed to do that." Bear blinked. "I gave you an order." The dog's tail moved once, barely. Caleb laughed and almost broke apart with it. "You stubborn son of a gun." Sirens sounded faintly beyond the pasture. Megan kept pressure on the bandage while Caleb slipped his hand beneath Bear's head. The dog tried to push toward him. "Don't." Bear ignored him. Even wounded, he wanted his body between Caleb and the room. That nearly destroyed Caleb. State vehicles reached the ranch first. Laura came through the door with 2 troopers. She saw Daniel, Richard, the cleared weapon, then Bear. Her face changed. "Vet, Greyhaven Harbor Clinic," Megan said. "They have emergency surgery." Laura pointed at a trooper. "Call ahead." Richard stepped forward. "Laura, don't. One word." He stopped. A trooper cuffed Daniel. Another approached Richard. The judge looked at Caleb. Caleb never turned. Richard's voice weakened. "I helped you when no one else would." Caleb kept one hand against Bear. "I know. I loved your father. I know. I was trying to protect our family." Caleb finally looked at him. His eyes were wet now. "You were protecting a name." Richard had no answer. Caleb looked down at Bear. "This is family." They carried Bear outside on a blanket. Snow fell across his sable coat. Caleb climbed into Laura's SUV with him, while Megan held the pressure dressing. George remained with the transfer list and the troopers. The vehicle tore down the ranch road. Bear's head rested against Caleb's thigh. His breathing was shallow. "Stay with me." Caleb stroked the gray fur around his muzzle. "You dragged me through nightmares." Bear blinked. "You found the fort." Another breath. "You found Pierce." Caleb bent closer. "You don't get to quit now." His voice cracked. "Not after teaching me how not to." Bear's paw shifted. It came to rest against Caleb's wrist. Outside, Black Cedar Ranch disappeared behind falling snow. The transfer list had survived. Andrew Pierce finally had proof. Richard Morgan's secret was over. But Caleb felt none of it. The truth had cost blood. And as Laura drove toward Greyhaven, with the siren cutting through the winter evening, Caleb understood that Bear had done more than break a command. The old dog had placed his body between Caleb and a bullet. Then, with one wounded sound, he had pulled Caleb back from becoming the man his anger wanted him to be. 23 minutes later, the doors of Greyhaven Harbor Veterinary Clinic opened beneath a hard white floodlight. Laura's SUV had barely stopped before Caleb climbed out with Bear wrapped in the blanket. "Gunshot wound," Megan called. "Upper shoulder. He's losing blood." 2 veterinary technicians rushed forward with a rolling stretcher. Caleb lowered Bear onto it. The shepherd's eyes opened. For 1 second, they found Caleb. Then the stretcher disappeared through a pair of swinging doors. "Bear." Caleb followed. A technician blocked him gently. "Sir, you have to stay here. I've handled trauma. I understand." "No, you don't." His voice came out sharper than he intended. The woman did not move. Behind her, Bear vanished around the corner. "We need room to save him. Save him." Those two words stopped Caleb. His hands dropped, the doors closed. Suddenly, there was nothing left to do. For a man who had spent much of his life solving problems by moving toward them, nothing was worse. Caleb stood in the hallway with Bear's blood drying across his coat. Outside the windows, Greyhaven Harbor lay beneath falling snow. Fishing boats rocked against black water, their mast lights trembling in the wind. Beyond them, the Pacific was invisible. Megan sat beside him. Caleb remained standing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. He watched the surgery light above the doors, red, still red. Megan finally said, "Sit down, I'm fine." "No, you're not." Caleb looked at her. She pointed at the chair beside her. "This isn't a mission. You don't get extra points for standing." He sat. His knee began trembling. He pressed both palms against it. Megan noticed. She said nothing, made it worse. Caleb stared at the dried blood on his fingers. "I ordered him to stay. I heard you." He knew, yes. He looked right at me. Megan nodded. And then he went anyway. Caleb swallowed. He used to do that with Ryan. At the name, Megan became still. Caleb had avoided saying it whenever possible. 8 years of silence had made 4 letters feel heavier than any weapon he had carried. Megan turned toward him. "What happened that day?" Caleb looked at the surgery doors. "You've read the report. I'm asking what happened to you." He closed his eyes, and Afghanistan returned, not as a memory, as weather, dust, heat, a concrete compound glowing beneath a white afternoon sun. A radio pressed against his ear. Ryan Keller crouched beside a broken wall. Bear younger then, leaner, waiting beside Caleb, a civilian hostage somewhere inside. Caleb opened his eyes. "We had bad intelligence." His voice was low. Entry point was supposed to be clear. It wasn't. Megan listened. "I was first through the breach, took fragments before I made 10 feet. He touched his left side without realizing it. Ryan pulled me behind cover. Caleb stared at the floor. "We needed someone on the east position. That was mine." Megan's breathing changed. Ryan went instead. Caleb nodded. "I told him not to." The memory came clearer. Ryan looking back, a grin that made no sense in that place, then disappearing behind the wall. Minutes later, he was dead. Megan lowered her eyes. Caleb continued. "The report said Ryan left his assigned position without authorization. I believed he did it because I failed mine. Caleb, I was team lead." His jaw tightened. "My job was to get everybody home. You were wounded. Didn't matter. It matters. Not to the dead." Megan looked at him for a long time. Then she reached into her bag. "I came to Greyhaven because of the envelope." Caleb glanced at her. "But that's not all I brought." She removed a small black field drive. Its casing was scratched and faded. Caleb recognized it immediately. Ryan's, his personal drive. "Where did you get that?" It came back with his effects. Megan held it carefully. "For years, we couldn't open half the files. Encryption. Dad tried. Navy people tried. Eventually we put it away." She looked toward the snow outside. After the news about Fort Alder, George contacted a retired communications specialist. Caleb stared at the drive. He unlocked it yesterday. Something inside Caleb tightened. Megan opened her phone. There was a voice file recorded 3 days before the operation. Caleb stood. "No, Caleb, I don't want to hear it. You need to," I said no. A fisherman in the waiting room glanced toward them. Caleb lowered his voice. "I've heard enough ghosts." Megan stood too. "So have I." That stopped him. Her eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. "You disappeared after Ryan died. My parents lost a son. Then we watched one of his closest friends erase himself because he thought suffering was some kind of payment." Caleb looked away. Megan stepped closer. "My brother knew you. He knew who I was then." "No." She shook her head. "He knew exactly who you'd become, if nobody stopped you." Caleb's gaze moved toward the surgery doors. Megan pressed play. Static filled the small waiting room. Then a man's voice, older only in memory, Ryan. "If you're hearing this, Meg, somebody finally broke my ridiculous password." Megan laughed through her tears. Caleb stopped breathing. Ryan continued. "We've got another run coming up. Morgan got tagged pretty good during training this week, and he's pretending his ribs aren't bothering him, because that's what Morgan does." Caleb's eyes closed. The voice continued. "If things change inside, I'm taking east." Caleb opened his eyes. Ryan had recorded it before the mission. "Before." "Caleb won't like that," Ryan said. "But he's faster making decisions when he's not fighting an injury. If I pull the outside fire, he can get the hostage team through the interior corridor." Caleb's lips parted. Megan watched him. Ryan's voice softened. "And if it goes bad, don't let anybody turn it into some story about Morgan failing me. I'm making the call." Caleb shook his head. "No." The recording continued. "He'll blame himself anyway. That's his worst habit." Caleb sat down. His legs simply stopped holding him. Ryan gave a quiet laugh through the speaker. "Tell him I said he doesn't get to disappear just because one of us doesn't come home." The recording ended. No music, no dramatic final words, only the hum of the clinic lights. Caleb stared at Megan's phone. "Why wasn't that in the report?" Laura checked. Megan sat beside him. The operation involved an intelligence source who remained active afterward. Ryan's position change and the reason for it were classified with the source protection material. The public report reduced it to unauthorized movement. Caleb looked at her. They knew, some people did. For 8 years, the full operational details were restricted. Caleb stood again. Anger arrived first. It was easier than grief. "I buried my marriage over that report." Megan said nothing. "I stopped calling my daughter because every time she asked when I was coming home, I thought she deserved somebody who hadn't gotten Ryan killed." His breathing quickened. "I left the contracting job. I stopped sleeping indoors. I spent 8 years thinking." His voice failed. Megan waited. Caleb pressed his palms against his eyes. "I thought he died fixing my mistake. He died making his choice." Caleb shook his head. "That's not better." "No," Don's voice cracked. "It isn't." He looked at her. She was crying now. "My brother is still dead." The anger left the room. There it was, the truth beneath all the others. No document could change that. No recording could return Ryan. No corrected report could give the Keller family another Christmas morning with him. Megan wiped her cheek. "But there is a difference between grief and guilt, Caleb." He looked down. "I don't know how to separate them anymore." "Then maybe you start now." Caleb stared through the window. Across the harbor, lights glowed inside small houses climbing the hill. For years he had watched lights like those from parking lots, rest areas, Roadside pullouts, other people's lives, other people's kitchens, other people's reasons to go home. He had believed exile was something he owed the dead. Now Ryan's voice had crossed 8 years to tell him it wasn't. The surgery light went dark. Caleb stood so quickly the chair scraped backward. A veterinarian emerged. Dr. Ellen Shaw was a small woman in blue scrubs, her surgical cap still on. Fatigue showed around her eyes. Caleb searched her face. "Is he alive?" She nodded. The bullet passed through the upper shoulder. It missed the major vessels. Caleb's mouth opened. Nothing came out. There was muscle damage and some bone fragmentation, but the joint is intact. His age makes recovery harder, and we'll watch closely for complications. "Can I see him in a few minutes?" "He's awake?" Dr. Shaw smiled. "Bear's awake." Caleb sat down, not because anyone told him to, because the strength went out of him. He bent forward, his hands covered his face. For 8 years he had not cried at Ryan's funeral. He had not cried when his wife finally stopped asking him to come home. He had not cried when he slept his first night in the Ford. He had not cried when an entire county room laughed at the homeless veteran buying a ruined fort for $50. Now the sound that came from him was quiet, almost embarrassed. Then it deepened. Megan put an arm around his shoulders. Caleb did not pull away. He cried for Ryan, for Bear, for Andrew Pierce behind the steel wall, for the years he had spent serving a sentence nobody had given him. And somewhere beneath all that grief was something Caleb had almost forgotten how to recognize. Relief, not happiness, not yet. Andrew Pierce had not been a thief. Ryan Keller had not died because Caleb failed him, and Caleb Morgan was not the man who should have died instead. Bear's paw remained over his hand. For the first time in 8 years, Caleb did not pull away from the possibility that surviving might have been something other than a punishment. Maybe it had been an order too. And maybe, after all these years, he was finally ready to obey it. The truth took longer to leave Fort Alder than the bullets had. Winter settled over Greyhaven Point, while investigators moved through 80 years of records, signatures, serial numbers, military correspondence, bank transfers, and testimony. Snow gathered along the cedar ridges east of town. Storms rolled in from the Pacific and broke white against the cliffs beneath the fort. Black Cedar Ranch disappeared beneath frost some mornings, while the Olympic peaks rose beyond it like pale walls against the sky. Caleb learned that justice rarely looked dramatic after the dangerous part was over. Mostly, it looked like paperwork. Laura Bennett called him twice a week. George Palmer practically moved into the county archive. Federal investigators traced the 42 navigation assemblies through serial numbers that Andrew Pierce had secretly copied before his death. The surviving transfer list proved that the equipment had been diverted from Navy custody in 1945 through shell companies connected to private defense buyers. At the center of the scheme was Edward Morgan, Caleb's grandfather. The name hurt differently now. It no longer felt like a blade. It felt like weight, something inherited, but not something he had to carry forever. Andrew Pierce's complaints had been genuine. His accusation had been buried. Charles Holloway had tried to help him preserve evidence and had spent the rest of his life allowing people to believe otherwise because fear had proved stronger than courage. Grant Holloway eventually gave investigators everything he had: property records, family letters, old photographs, financial documents. He admitted he had known enough to suspect that Fort Alder contained evidence damaging to both families. That was why he had traveled the abandoned military road. That was why he had offered Caleb $30,000, then $100,000. He had wanted the fort closed before the past could speak, but he had not ordered the attack in the tunnel. He had not ordered anyone to shoot Bear. That trail led back to Richard Morgan. Caleb's uncle was charged with obstruction, conspiracy, attempted destruction of evidence, and crimes connected to the attack at Black Cedar Ranch. The man who had once paid for Caleb's motel room now sat behind glass during preliminary hearings, while attorneys discussed the destruction of a family legacy he had nearly destroyed other people to protect. Caleb attended only once. Richard saw him across the courtroom. Neither man waved. Neither man looked away. Afterward, Laura found Caleb standing beneath the courthouse awning while cold rain silvered the street. "You all right?" Caleb watched cars pass. Laura waited. Then Caleb added, "But I think that's allowed." A small smile touched her face. "Getting smarter. Don't spread it around." Bear's recovery was slower. For 6 weeks, Caleb's world narrowed to medication schedules, bandage changes, short walks, veterinary appointments, and arguments with a German shepherd who considered medical restrictions a personal insult. The bullet wound healed. The damaged shoulder never returned completely to what it had been. Bear developed a slight limp. On cold mornings, it became more noticeable. Caleb hated it. Bear did not appear particularly interested in Caleb's opinion. The first time Dr. Shaw allowed Bear to walk 50 yards outside the clinic, the old shepherd immediately attempted to inspect a fishing boat. "Absolutely not," Caleb said. Bear continued toward it. "You're retired." Bear kept walking. "You've been shot." No response. "You're 9 years old." Bear stopped and looked back. Caleb pointed toward the clinic. "Don't give me that face." Bear gave him exactly that face. For the first time, Caleb laughed without feeling guilty afterward. By February, Andrew Pierce had his name back. The Navy's formal review concluded that Lieutenant Andrew Pierce had attempted to prevent the unlawful diversion of military equipment and preserve evidence for investigators. His desertion designation was removed from the historical record. George brought the letter to Fort Alder himself. He found Caleb repairing a window frame in the upper barracks. Bear lay nearby on an old wool blanket, watching the hammer with suspicion. George held out the envelope. "It's done." Caleb read the first page standing beside the window. Outside, afternoon light stretched across the Pacific. He read it again. Then he walked down through the fort, past the command chamber, past the steel panel, past the place where Bear had first refused to move. The chamber where Andrew Pierce had died was protected now behind temporary conservation barriers. Caleb stood there with Bear. For a while, neither moved. "They fixed it," Caleb said. Bear's ears shifted. His name, the dog, leaned it lightly against Caleb's leg. Caleb rested a hand on his head. "I wish somebody had gotten here sooner." George had followed them, but remained near the corridor entrance. "Someone did," he said. Caleb looked back. George nodded toward Bear. "Just took 80 years." The 42 assemblies never became Caleb's fortune. Their estimated historical, collector, and material value remained roughly $4.2 million, but legal ownership and federal restrictions made their future clear. The devices were transferred into protected custody, while museums and military institutions worked out long-term conservation. Reporters repeatedly asked Caleb whether he felt cheated. The question confused him. He had spent $50 because he needed somewhere to sleep. He had found a dead officer who needed someone to believe him. Those were not the same transaction. Then something happened Caleb had not expected. Money came to Fort Alder anyway. Not treasure money, restoration money. Federal historic preservation grants came first. Then Washington veterans organizations offered labor. A nonprofit serving homeless former service members proposed converting the upper barracks into transitional housing. The plan included 8 small rooms, a shared kitchen, showers, a workshop, counseling space, and a fenced outdoor area for retired military working dogs. Caleb stared at the proposal for a long time. Laura sat across from him at a folding table. "You hate it." "No, you've been staring at page 3 for 10 minutes. They want me to run it." "Resident caretaker, I saw. You already live here. That's different." "How?" Caleb looked around the battered watchroom, because living somewhere and belonging somewhere were still different things in his mind. He did not say it. Laura seemed to hear it anyway. "They aren't giving you charity, Caleb." His jaw tightened. "I didn't say they were. You were about to." Bear lifted his head. Laura pointed at him. "Even he knows. He's biased. He's smarter than you. That's becoming a popular opinion." The job came with a salary, health insurance, veterinary coverage for Bear, and something Caleb had not possessed in years, an address that meant more than where his truck happened to stop. He signed. Spring arrived slowly along the Olympic Peninsula. Snow withdrew into the mountains. Pastures turned green beneath long bands of rain. Cattle returned to the lower fields. At Fort Alder, broken windows became new windows. Rusted electrical conduit came down. Volunteers carried lumber through corridors where soldiers had once carried ammunition. One of the first veterans to arrive was a 58-year-old former Army medic named Tom Willis, who had been sleeping behind a feed store outside Port Angeles. He came with everything he owned in 2 duffel bags. Caleb showed him the room. Tom stood in the doorway. "Lockwork? Yeah. From inside?" Caleb understood the question. From inside. Tom nodded. That was all. Later, Caleb found him sitting on the edge of the bed with the door closed. Caleb kept walking. Sometimes dignity meant knowing when not to knock. A brass plaque eventually went beside the restored command chamber. Lieutenant Andrew Pierce, United States, Navy, stood between duty and theft. The record now stands with him. Caleb refused to put his own name anywhere, George argued. Caleb won. Bear received a photograph in the working dog room. Caleb lost that argument completely. Grant Holloway came to Fort Alder once before leaving Greyhaven. He stood outside the gate in a dark coat, looking toward the cliffs. "I thought protecting my family meant protecting the story," he said. Caleb stood beside Bear. "Stories don't need protection." Grant nodded. "People do." He looked at Bear's limp. "I'm sorry." Caleb did not tell him it was all right. It wasn't. But he shook Grant's hand before the man left. Forgiveness, Caleb was learning, did not require pretending damage had never happened. Megan stayed, not at the fort, not exactly. Black Cedar Ranch had belonged to her mother's side of the family years earlier, and after the investigation cleared the property, Megan began helping restore the farmhouse. Caleb helped sometimes. At first they talked about Ryan, then they discovered they could talk about other things: weather, bad coffee, dogs, broken tractors, the ridiculous price of lumber. Ordinary conversation felt strangely brave. One evening in April, Caleb finished repairing part of the farmhouse porch after sunset. Megan brought 2 mugs outside. Bear slept beside the steps. "You know," she said, "Ryan would hate how serious you've made all of this." Caleb looked at her. He was serious. Ryan once put hot sauce in your toothpaste. Caleb stared. "I knew that was him. You blamed the corpsman. The corpsman had motive." Megan laughed. Bear opened one eye. Caleb laughed too. The sound traveled into the pasture. Nothing terrible followed it. That mattered. Months after Bear had been shot, on a cool May evening, Caleb parked the old Ford beside Black Cedar Ranch. The truck still rattled. The bumper still leaned slightly left. He could afford something better now. He kept telling himself he would replace it. Some things took longer to leave than others. He opened the driver's door. "Come on, Bear." The shepherd stood beside the truck. He looked at the open cab, then he looked toward the farmhouse. Warm light glowed behind the windows. Megan was inside. A kettle whistled faintly. Caleb tapped the seat. "Let's go home." Bear did not move. Caleb frowned. "Bear." The dog turned away from the truck. He walked slowly across the yard. The limp was still there, small, permanent. Caleb watched him reach the porch. Bear climbed the first step, then the second. He stopped before the farmhouse door and looked back. Caleb stood beside the open truck. For a moment, the years folded together. He saw another door. Cold steel, Fort Alder, a storm outside. Bear sitting before a blast door that county blueprints said had nothing behind it. Caleb remembered asking him what he heard. Bear had refused to leave that closed door because truth was waiting behind it. Now the old dog sat before an open one. Warm light spilled across his paws. Megan appeared. She looked at Bear, then at Caleb. She did not make the moment larger than it needed to be. She simply held the door open. "Coffee?" Caleb looked back at his truck. There had been a time when everything he owned fit inside it. Blanket, boots, canned food, a photograph, a dog. Enough memories to make sleep dangerous. The truck had kept him alive, but survival and living were not the same thing. Behind him, beyond the dark ridge, Fort Alder stood above the Pacific. It had not made him rich. It had done something stranger. It had returned Andrew Pierce's honor. It had exposed a crime buried beneath Caleb's own family name. It had forced Grant Holloway to choose truth over inheritance. It had given homeless veterans rooms with locks on the inside. It had returned Ryan Keller's final choice to the man who had spent 8 years misunderstanding it. And Bear had done what Bear always did. He had found the door Caleb could not see. Caleb closed the truck. The sound echoed softly across the yard. Then he walked toward the farmhouse. Bear's tail moved once. Megan stepped aside. Caleb crossed the threshold. No applause, no grand declaration. Just warm light, coffee, an old dog, and a place where nobody was asking him to disappear. Behind them, Bear remained near the doorway until Caleb was fully inside. Only then did he follow. At the beginning, Bear had refused to leave a sealed door because the truth was trapped behind it. At the end, he refused to leave an open door because life was waiting on the other side. And Caleb Morgan finally understood the lesson his old partner had been trying to teach him long before Fort Alder ever entered their lives. Loyalty was not only staying beside someone when the bullets came. Sometimes loyalty was standing at their doorway after the war was over, and refusing to move until the person you loved finally came home. If you believe Caleb made the right choice by protecting the truth instead of the money, type yes in the comments. And if stories about loyalty, justice, and ordinary people standing their ground still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.